Bradley Lewis was born on October 15, 1997, in Kingswood, a small town in southwestern England, where he spent his life. His family was typical of many English working-class families. His father worked at a local factory, and his mother worked at a small pharmacy. Bradley was the only child in the family, and this may have played a role in shaping his character. From an early age, he was a source of pride for his parents, a kind and caring young man who tried not to disappoint them. At school, Bradley was not only a good student but also an active participant in school life. He was into sports, especially football, and was pretty popular with his peers. His grades were solid, and after high school he decided to go to college to continue his education. He chose a business management major, hoping to work in the business world in the future. However, his college career didn't last long. After his first year, Bradley felt that education was not fulfilling for him and decided to change the course of his life. After Bradley left school, he returned to Kingswood, where he got a job at a construction company. His hard work and determination allowed him to quickly secure a stable position in the company. He was known among his colleagues as a reliable and honest worker who was always willing to help others when they found themselves in difficult situations. In his free time, Bradley often spent time with friends, participating in various activities, and also found solace in active recreation, such as cycling and fishing. At some point in his life, Abigail White came into his life. It happened about 2 years ago when they met at a party at a pub where Bradley often spent his evenings with friends. Abigail was a bright and confident young woman who immediately caught Bradley's attention. She was a few years younger than him, but they quickly found common ground and began a relationship. Abigail, like Bradley, was from a small town, but her life had been much more difficult. She was independent and ambitious, not limiting herself in her choice of career opportunity. Their relationship developed rapidly, and a few months after they met, they moved in together. Bradley was impressed by Abigail's determination, her ambition, and her desire to improve her life. She often supported him in his plans and endeavors. Together, they began to make plans for the future, and Bradley even considered continuing his education and returning to school. But his career ambitions still came first. Abigail also seemed like his complete opposite, which at some point attracted him even more. The couple got to know each other's friends and sometimes spent time outside the city, relaxing in small cottages in the suburbs of Kingswood. It seemed like a typical romantic story of a young couple, but, as in many relationships, there were difficulties. They would argue from time to time, but they always made up, and Bradley often said that Abigail was the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. There was a lot of good in their relationship, but despite this, there was always something in the air, a tension that eventually came to a head. On March 25, 2022, on that fateful evening, Bradley and Abigail spent the day together. As usual, they went to their local pub where Bradley met up with a few friends. The evening promised to be quiet, and as always, the locals gathered at the pub to spend time together and enjoy a drink. But as often happens, the evening did not end as they had planned. An argument broke out between Bradley and Abigail. By the time they left the pub, the tension between them was at its peak. Outwardly, nothing unusual was happening, but both were clearly in an agitated state. Bradley felt that the relationship was becoming complicated, and Abigail was upset that she had not been supported in an argument with several people she had encountered at the pub. The couple left the pub, and upon returning home, Abigail discovered the unimaginable. Bradley was lying in the kitchen with a stab wound to his chest. His breathing was weak, and despite her attempts to help, she was unable to save him. Abigail panicked and dialed 911, but the paramedics who arrived a few minutes later were unable to do anything. Bradley was dead. The police arrived at the scene, but it was not immediately clear what had happened. Abigail claimed she did not know how it had happened, and although there were obvious traces of blood, the accident theory did not seem plausible. This marked the beginning of an investigation, but the police were still unable to answer the main question: who was involved in the murder of Bradley Lewis? Description of the crime scene. When the police arrived at the scene, the situation in the house was fairly normal, which immediately alarmed the investigators. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or damage to the premises. Only 2 people were in the house: Abigail White and her deceased boyfriend Bradley Lewis. Bradley was lying in the kitchen. Next to him on the floor was a knife with obvious traces of blood, but otherwise the scene looked quite ordinary. The only exception was the blood that covered part of the floor and kitchen surfaces, apparently left behind from the severe stab wound that caused Bradley's death. According to the police, Abigail was in shock. When she saw the officers arrive, she immediately began to tell them what had happened. Her speech was confused and sometimes interrupted, but the main points remained the same. She had tried to help Bradley, but he had died. She claimed that when they returned home, she and Bradley had continued to argue, but then he had suddenly been injured. Abigail explained that it was some kind of misunderstanding that led to the tragedy. Her words betrayed her confusion and fear, and although her testimony seemed sincere, it did not give investigators a clear picture of what had happened. Abigail approached Bradley with a knife to scare him, to shock him. She claimed that she had no intention of hurting him, but before she realized what had happened, the knife was in his chest. It all happened so fast that she didn't have time to comprehend what had happened. According to her, it was all over before she realized what she had done. When she realized that Bradley was seriously injured, she immediately tried to help him. Abigail said that she helped Bradley take off his clothes to stop the bleeding. She claimed that they did it together, but there was no time to save him. She helped him move to the kitchen, trying to use his t-shirt to cover the wound. Bradley sat down at first, but then his body fell and he was lying on his back. That was when Abigail realized that her efforts were futile. Bradley was dead. When the police questioned her, Abigail initially claimed that Bradley had injured himself. She said she didn't know how it had happened and that she was sure there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Several important questions immediately arose. Why couldn't she give a clearer explanation of what had happened in the house? Why wasn't she sure what had happened? These questions seemed important, and investigators knew they had to proceed very carefully so as not to overlook any details. Abigail claimed that she did not know who could be responsible for what had happened, and that she herself could not have struck Bradley. She also stated that when she saw him injured, she immediately tried to administer first aid, but it was too late. However, her story did not match the facts at the scene. In the kitchen where Bradley's body was found, there was a knife that turned out to be the murder weapon. It was found next to the body and looked like a regular kitchen knife. There were no other suspicious items in the room. This also alarmed investigators. Usually in cases of domestic murders, the killer or criminal leaves behind not only the victim, but also clues that can reveal their motives and the course of events. But in this case, there was nothing of the sort. All that remained was the knife, blood on the floor, and a few strange details in Abigail's testimony. Investigators began collecting evidence. Traces of blood were found on the floor where Bradley lay, but there were no obvious signs of a struggle in the house. There were no scattered items, broken or damaged objects, nothing that could indicate violence. Only the knife and traces of blood on the surface, combined with Abigail's incomplete and contradictory statements, led to the conclusion that something in this picture did not add up. She kept repeating that she didn't see who could have inflicted the wound, and despite her apparent distress, investigators began to doubt her story more and more. Was her testimony sincere, or was she hiding the truth? There were several theories that piqued the investigators' interest. The first was that Abigail could have accidentally fatally wounded Bradley during the altercation. However, even in this case, many questions remained. Why couldn't she give more precise answers about what had happened? Why couldn't she say exactly how it happened if her version of an accident was true? The second theory was that Abigail might have been involved in a premeditated murder. Perhaps the argument was the catalyst for her actions, and when the situation got out of control, she decided to take the ultimate step. But despite these theories, investigators did not have enough evidence to say for sure what happened on that fateful evening. There were no witnesses in the house, and the surveillance camera at the pub could not provide accurate information about how the argument between Abigail and Bradley continued after they returned home. She only recorded a general moment of their conflict at the pub, which did not seem significant enough to cause such a tragedy. Around the same time that investigators discovered that Abigail had changed her story several times, they began to ask themselves new questions. There were no unusual signs of violence at the crime scene, which in theory could indicate that it was not an accident. From that moment on, the investigation was just beginning. Time and the collection of evidence would eventually reveal the truth about what happened that night. However, each step brought the investigators closer to a definitive answer, although at that point, none of the theories could be confirmed. After the police began their investigation, CCTV footage from the pub where Abigail and Bradley had argued before returning home became an important part of the investigation. The cameras captured the argument, but unfortunately they did not show what happened inside the house when the couple returned. These recordings only confirmed that a serious argument had taken place between them, but they were unlikely to be decisive evidence in establishing what happened later. The police could not rely solely on these images, as they did not show what was happening inside the house. This was the first major obstacle in the investigation for the investigators, as the murder had taken place inside the house, and now they had to find out what had actually happened between the two people after they left the pub. When Abigail was questioned, her testimony began to change, which immediately caught the attention of investigators. At first, she claimed that she had not seen anything, that she did not know how Bradley had been injured, and that events had unfolded too quickly for her to comprehend. She claimed that it was all an accident, and that she could not explain who could have stabbed him or how. However, her story later became contradictory. Abigail admitted that during the argument, she had taken a knife from the kitchen. She explained that she had only intended to scare Bradley, but could not explain why the knife ended up in his chest. This admission raised many questions for investigators. At first glance, her confession seemed sincere, but the contradictions in Abigail's story immediately made investigators suspicious. Why did she first claim that she saw nothing and then admit that she took the knife from the kitchen? Why did she choose that particular moment to confess her role in what had happened? Investigators began to realize that her testimony might be distorted, which could mean that she was hiding important details or trying to justify her actions. The investigation had reached a point where it was necessary to gather as much information as possible to confirm or refute Abigail's testimony. The police continued to collect evidence. The testimony of neighbors played an important role in this process. Although they had not witnessed the crime itself, they were able to describe the couple's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. Some neighbors said that Abigail and Bradley's relationship had become more tense recently, that they had been arguing frequently, and that both seemed to be going through difficult times. This testimony helped investigators form a more complete picture of what was going on in their lives. However, the most important element of the investigation was the analysis of the bloody traces found in the house. When investigators examined the crime scene, they noticed details that could indicate that the murder was not accidental. The blood left on the floor and kitchen surfaces suggested that the knife wound was inflicted while Bradley was conscious and trying to respond to Abigail's actions. Blood stains on various parts of the kitchen indicated that he had tried to move, but his condition was deteriorating, which was consistent with Abigail's account of how she tried to help him after the wound was inflicted. All of this formed an important picture of the events that investigators had to piece together. The police also analyzed the knife found near Bradley's body. It was a standard kitchen knife with no particular features indicating that it had been used as a murder weapon beforehand. However, experts found that the knife was sharp enough to inflict a fatal wound with a single blow to the chest. What was surprising was that the knife was found next to Bradley's body and not in Abigail's hands, which made investigators wonder why she did not try to dispose of the murder weapon if it was indeed an accident. These details seemed strange and suggested that something in her story did not add up. The medical examiner confirmed that Bradley's death occurred quickly after he was wounded. She explained that the injury was fatal and that death most likely occurred within minutes of the blow. This fact was further evidence that the entire scene of Bradley's death was at least partially staged and that her actions were not accidental. This, of course, did not prove Abigail's direct involvement in the murder, but it became clear that she could have been involved to a significant extent. The evidence gathered and the testimony of neighbors increasingly pointed to the fact that the relationship between Abigail and Bradley was indeed tense, and that she probably made the decision to act without hesitation during the argument. Investigators began to piece together a picture of how their conflict-ridden relationship could have led to tragedy. Witness statements and analysis of the crime scene confirmed that the argument that triggered the tragedy was not accidental. Each new piece of evidence further convinced investigators that Abigail could have been involved in the murder and that she had tried to hide the truth about her actions. Now the investigators were faced with the task of not only uncovering the events of that fateful evening, but also understanding what could have prompted Abigail to make such a decision. To do this, they needed to continue gathering evidence, and each piece could be the key to solving the mystery. One thing was clear: the case was becoming increasingly complicated, and it was important to find the moment that could explain what really happened on that fateful evening that ended in tragedy. On March 28, 2022, a few days after the tragedy, Abigail White was arrested. Investigators, carefully analyzing all the evidence and testimony gathered, concluded that she was involved in the murder of Bradley Lewis. At that point, the investigation had sufficient grounds for suspicion. Abigail's contradictory statements, her inability to accurately explain what happened in the house, and numerous inconsistencies in her stories became increasingly apparent. At the same time, forensic evidence clearly confirmed that the stab wound that caused Bradley's death was inflicted intentionally, not accidentally, as Abigail herself claimed. These facts convinced investigators that Abigail may have been not only a witness to the tragedy, but also a direct participant. Abigail's arrest was an important turning point in the investigation. Despite her emotional testimony, full of fear and confusion, the police could not ignore the obvious inconsistencies and the growing amount of evidence pointing to her possible guilt. She continued to insist that she had no intention of killing Bradley and that what happened was an accident. However, her own confessions, which changed during the interrogations, became the main argument of the investigation against her. At one point, she admitted that she had taken a knife from the kitchen, but claimed that she had only intended to scare Bradley, not to fatally wound him. However, the lack of other obvious signs of violence and the flawed logic of her story contradicted this version of events. When the police presented Abigail with irrefutable evidence, her position changed. Investigators provided her with the results of a forensic medical examination, which showed that the wound inflicted on Bradley was severe and deliberate, indicating intentional action. The wound could not have been accidental. The knife had been plunged with such force that it caused death within minutes. Experts who examined the bloodstains found that the crime scene did not match the typical scenario of an accidental injury. In addition, evidence found in the house indicated that there had been no attempt to fight off the killer, which also cast doubt on Abigail's claim that it was an accident. Despite her attempts to justify her actions, investigators were convinced that she was responsible for Bradley's death. They believed that during the argument, which Abigail claimed began in the pub, she lost control of the situation. Nervousness, aggression, and pent-up emotions led her to decide to stab him. According to investigators, all of Abigail's actions that evening were the result of her rash behavior in a moment of emotional distress. When Abigail was arrested, she could no longer hide the fact that her actions had led to tragedy. Contradictions in her testimony began to work against her. At the time of her arrest, she was presented with concrete evidence, including surveillance footage from the pub, medical reports, and blood analysis results. This evidence showed that she had been actively involved in the incident and that her actions were deliberate. Investigators believed that she had not only struck the victim but also attempted to conceal the truth, possibly out of fear for her own life and the lives of her children. When Abigail was arrested, she was informed of her rights and the procedure for further action. The police conducted additional interviews with her, during which she did not deny that she had wounded Bradley, but again claimed that it was not done with the intention to kill. Investigators continued to insist that her actions were deliberate. At this stage, it became clear that Abigail was trying to mislead the investigation, which only served to strengthen suspicions. Later, analyzing the entire spectrum of events, investigators concluded that the quarrel between Abigail and Bradley in the pub was only the beginning of what led to the tragedy. The couple was experiencing serious emotional and psychological difficulties. Witnesses and neighbors reported numerous conflicts between them in recent months. Abigail repeatedly complained about Bradley, claiming that he did not support her. These circumstances only reinforced the investigators' version that during the argument at home, she was unable to control her emotions and decided to kill him. After her arrest, Abigail was taken into custody and preparations for the trial began. Investigators continued to gather all possible evidence to prove her guilt and prepare the final indictment. Every detail, every piece of information obtained from witnesses, analysis of bloodstains and other physical evidence gradually pieced together a clear picture of what happened on that fateful evening. Abigail's arrest was an important milestone in the investigation. The police were confident that she was entirely responsible for Bradley's death, and their further work was focused on proving her guilt in court. Contradictions in her testimony and inconsistencies with the reality of the events continued to raise suspicions, and investigators were confident that the truth about what had happened would soon be revealed. The trial at Bristol Crown Court began with a detailed examination of the circumstances surrounding the crime that led to the death of Bradley Lewis. Abigail White was charged with the murder of her boyfriend, and her version of events was presented during the trial. She admitted her guilt in manslaughter but claimed that her actions were not intended to kill Bradley. Abigail explained that she took a knife from the kitchen to shock and scare Bradley, but did not realize what had happened until it was too late. She claimed that during the argument she was in a highly emotional state, lost control, and could not predict the consequences of her actions. However, evidence gathered during the investigation contradicted her testimony. A forensic medical examination showed that the knife wound was intentional and aimed at a vital part of the body. Surveillance cameras from the pub confirmed that there was a conflict between Abigail and Bradley, but could not clarify what happened in the house after the couple returned home. Also, bloodstain analysis at the crime scene, along with medical examiner data, showed that Bradley died quickly, which backed up the idea that the stab was meant to cause serious harm. Despite Abigail's admission of manslaughter, the judge and jury could not ignore the fact that her actions were the result of her aggressive emotions at the time of the altercation. Investigators and lawyers argued that Abigail had the opportunity to stop her actions but continued, which ultimately led to the tragic outcome. The court also considered her behavior after the crime, when she initially tried to conceal the true circumstances of what had happened, claiming that Bradley had injured himself. This behavior raised doubts about her sincerity and whether she truly understood the consequences of her actions. The couple's personal life was also discussed during the trial. The court proceedings revealed a lot of information about the toxic relationship between Abigail and Bradley. Witnesses testified about frequent arguments and heated conflicts that occurred in their lives. This added important information to the case, emphasizing that their relationship was extremely tense, which could have been a factor influencing Abigail's behavior at the time of the crime. Particular attention was paid in court to her emotional state. According to experts, Abigail was under severe psychological pressure due to accumulated relationship problems and her difficult life situation. The defense tried to prove that her actions were provoked by emotions and aggression caused by her difficult relationship with Bradley, which could have mitigated the punishment. However, despite her admission of manslaughter and the mitigating circumstances, the court was harsh in its decision. The prosecution insisted that her actions were deliberate and that she should be held responsible for Bradley's death. The judge and jury concluded that Abigail had inflicted a fatal wound on her partner as a result of aggression that crossed all boundaries, leading to the death of a person. Although she did not have the clear intention to kill Bradley, her actions were extremely dangerous and led to tragic consequences. The court also took into account her admission of guilt, which was a mitigating factor, as well as the fact that she did not hide her actions and confessed to the murder. However, despite her remorse, the court felt that the punishment should be severe to emphasize the seriousness of her actions. On October 21, 2022, Bristol Crown Court found Abigail White guilty of the murder of Bradley Lewis. The trial also revealed details of her toxic relationship with Bradley, as well as her behavior after the crime, which added further weight to the court's decision. The court ruled that Abigail White would be sentenced to life imprisonment. However, given her guilty plea and mitigating circumstances, the sentence was set with the possibility of applying for early release after 20 years. Stephen Moore was born in 1976 in New Jersey to Evelyn Moore and her husband, who left the family when Stephen was 8 years old. From an early age, he grew up in a peaceful and loving environment where mutual support, attention to detail, and a desire to maintain inner dignity were core values. Evelyn Moore worked as a nurse and from an early age taught her son the value of hard work, the need to earn a living, and the importance of keeping one's word. Stephen did well in school. He was not an honors student, but he always completed his assignments on time and paid special attention to physical education, which gradually developed into a passion for speed skating. And speed skating, he competed in state-level youth competitions, demonstrating his strength of character and ability to overcome fatigue. After high school, Stephen enrolled in a local community college, where he studied a technical major with the goal of finding a job that would allow him to get on his feet quickly without being tied to a long and expensive academic career. While in school, he continued to train and work part-time at an auto repair shop, earning a steady income that allowed him to help his mother, pay rent, and cover personal expenses. Stephen was a calm, reserved person, not prone to impulsive behavior. He preferred to resolve conflicts through negotiation and avoided unnecessary arguments, which allowed him to maintain good relationships with colleagues and neighbors. In early 2006, Stephen got a job at a Honda dealership in New Jersey, where he quickly established himself as an executive employee. He knew how to talk to customers, giving them the impression of reliability and honesty, which gradually enabled him to achieve stable personal sales and regular bonuses, allowing him to save some money for his future plans. That same year, he met Kathleen Dorsett at a local sporting event where she had come to support a friend participating in a charity run, and Stephen was helping with the organization of equipment and parking for participants. Kathleen worked as an elementary school teacher and came across as a calm, attentive woman who was passionate about her work. He talked about her classes and how important it was to teach children discipline and neatness, and her words conveyed a desire to bring order to the little things, from the arrangement of children's books to the lesson schedule. Their relationship developed gradually through communication, meetings in cafes, walks along the embankment, and evenings spent talking about their plans for the future, where both spoke of their desire to have a family, stability, and a home where their children would feel safe. In June 27, Stephen and Kathleen got married in a modest ceremony attended by close relatives and a few friends. They rented a small apartment. Stephen continued to work at the dealership, and Kathleen taught at a school and brought home notebooks to grade, discussing with her husband the difficulties with individual students and plans for school holidays. Their marriage seemed stable with clearly defined roles, where Kathleen took care of budgeting and everyday shopping while Stephen paid the big bills and dealt with technical issues around the house and car. In 2008, they had a daughter, Elizabeth, which was an important moment for both of them, cementing their confidence in their life together and their plans for the future. Kathleen took maternity leave, focusing on caring for her daughter, methodically organizing her feeding, walks, and medical appointments. Stephen was happy to help with childcare, but when Kathleen returned to work, he began to notice that she was becoming more demanding about the daily routine, controlling every aspect of Elizabeth's life, from choosing baby food to picking out clothes. During 2009, the first signs of tension began to emerge when Kathleen increasingly left Elizabeth with her parents, Thomas and Leslie Dorsett, explaining that she needed to focus on work and household chores. Kathleen's parents lived in Oakhurst, New Jersey, in a spacious house with a large yard which allowed Elizabeth to spend time outdoors. But Stephen increasingly felt that he was gradually distancing himself from his daughter, losing the opportunity to directly influence her upbringing. Kathleen insisted on certain rules and a schedule for visits, often changing the arrangements, which led to arguments, although Stephen tried to resolve these issues peacefully, striving to maintain a calm atmosphere in the family for the sake of the child. According to Stephen's colleagues, he did not share his problems openly, but became more withdrawn and pensive, staying late at work and taking extra shifts to compensate for the growing expenses associated with caring for his child. By June 2010, the divorce proceedings between Kathleen and Stephen were finalized, with Kathleen receiving primary custody of Elizabeth, while Stephen retained the right to regular visits with his daughter, which formally appeared to be a compromise but in practice led to new disputes over visitation schedules and conditions. Kathleen planned to move to Florida with her daughter and her parents, citing a desire to start a new life in a warmer climate and find a better job there. However, the move required Stephen's consent, as well as his financial support for the initial period after the move, which caused new disagreements related to expenses, child support, and issues of regular access to the child. Kathleen and Stephen's neighbors and acquaintances did not notice any open conflicts, as both maintained a polite and reserved demeanor in public, maintaining the appearance of a peaceful family life. Although in reality, mistrust and a cold distance were growing between them. On the morning of August 16, 2010, at 8:15 a.m., Stephen arrived at Kathleen's parents' home in Oakhurst to drop off Elizabeth after spending the weekend with his daughter. He was carrying a bag with children's belongings, including a change of clothes and toys, and smiled as he handed it to Kathleen outside the house, according to their established schedule. He went inside to help Elizabeth. It seemed like a normal morning for parents exchanging their child after the weekend, and there was no indication that Stephen would not be in contact for the next 2 days and that his phone would be unavailable to his colleagues and relatives. Against the backdrop of a warm August morning and a quiet street in Oakhurst, none of the neighbors could have imagined that this was the last morning Stephen would bring his daughter to this house, and that the countdown had begun to events that would soon shake the entire town and call into question the peaceful life the family had maintained for several years. Stephen did not return to his car at the usual time, did not call his mother, Evelyn Moore, who usually called him in the evening to find out how his day had gone, and did not show up for work at the Honda dealership, where he worked regular hours and always gave advance notice of any delay. His absence was unusual for his co-workers, as Stephen was known for being punctual and rarely broke his work routine, especially at the beginning of the week when new orders came in and potential customers were most likely to visit the dealership. Initially, his co-workers assumed that he might be delayed by personal matters related to his daughter or family issues. But when Stephen's phone remained unanswered throughout the workday on August 16 and the following hours, they began to express concern, trying to call him on his cell phone and sending short messages asking about his whereabouts. The next day, August 17, the situation remained unclear, as Stephen did not show up for work again, did not contact his manager, and did not get in touch with his mother, which finally alarmed those around him. Evelyn Moore, upon learning of her son's absence from the dealership, began calling Stephen's closest acquaintances, including relatives and mutual friends who sometimes helped Elizabeth with transportation, but none of them knew where he might be. At this point, it became clear to relatives and dealership employees that something out of the ordinary had happened, as even when he was involved in conflicts or domestic difficulties, he always kept in touch and notified his colleagues if there were any delays. Evelyn Moore reported her son missing to the local police, stating that he was last seen on the morning of August 16 near Kathleen Dorsett's parents' home. On August 18, 2010, in Long Branch, New Jersey, on one of the quiet streets located near residential neighborhoods, a local resident noticed smoke coming from a parked car. The fire department was called to extinguish the fire, which had already engulfed a significant portion of the car's body and interior. Firefighters who arrived at the scene opened the car to extinguish the fire and found the body of a man in the trunk. The car was identified as a 2001 Nissan Altima, registered to Evelyn Moore, Stephen's mother, which was the first official confirmation of a connection between the car and the missing man who had been searched for over the past 2 days. Local police who arrived at the scene began examining the car and the surrounding area, assessing damage to the body and interior, and recording all details for subsequent forensic analysis. Inside the car, despite significant damage, experts noted that the body had been placed in the trunk in a position indicating an attempt to conceal it, rather than the person being accidentally left in the car. Experts began collecting biological samples from burnt clothing found in the trunk for further identification of the deceased. A check of the vehicle's chassis and registration numbers confirmed that the car belonged to Evelyn Moore. During the preliminary examination, forensic experts found traces of fuel and lubricants in the trunk, indicating that a flammable liquid had been deliberately used to accelerate the spread of fire inside the car. Traces of burnt plastic elements and synthetic materials were found at the scene, which were subsequently seized for chemical analysis. The body was taken to the morgue for a forensic examination where experts noted that the degree of burning made visual identification difficult, but intact items of clothing and objects were found that could indicate the identity of the deceased. These included fabric remnants matching the color and texture of the clothes Stephen Moore usually wore to work, as well as fragments of a belt and shoes which were later confirmed as belonging to Stephen. Final confirmation of the deceased's identity was made through dental records and DNA testing, which was compared with biomaterial from Evelyn Moore's mother, officially confirming that the body found in the trunk of the burned car belonged to Stephen Moore. After establishing the identity of the deceased, the police launched an extensive investigation, focusing on determining the route taken by the Nissan Altima from the time Stephen disappeared until the car was found in Long Branch. Surveillance camera footage from nearby streets was reviewed to determine the exact time the car was at the scene of the fire and to identify who was driving the car during that period. Forensic experts also began analyzing the remains of combustible materials and components left in the trunk and interior of the car to identify sources and possible clues that could point to those involved in moving the car and setting it on fire. At this point, the case took on a new status, moving from a routine disappearance to an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the deceased man's body, with the motives, identities of those involved, and details of the events leading to Stephen's death remaining unknown. For the Moore family and police officers, the situation appeared to be a sudden and tragic accident with no obvious explanation, requiring a search for answers that could be hidden in the details of Stephen's last hours, his movements, and the contacts he may have had on the day of his disappearance. This stage became the starting point for building theories, checking alibis and analyzing data, which would later shed light on the circumstances of what happened. After it was established that the body found in the trunk of the burned-out Nissan Altima belonged to Stephen Moore, the police launched an extensive investigation to determine the events leading up to his disappearance. In the first phase, investigators focused on analyzing Stephen's phone records to determine his movements and contacts in the final hours before his disappearance. According to cell phone data, Stephen's phone was last active on the morning of August 16 in the Oakhurst area, confirming that he had arrived at Kathleen Dorsett's parents' home at the agreed time to drop off his daughter Elizabeth. After that, there was no further activity on the device, indicating that the phone had been turned off immediately after the visit. Police officers also checked CCTV cameras installed on streets leading to the Dorsett's home and on sections of the road where Stephen's car or his mother's Nissan Altima could have traveled after his disappearance. Analysis of footage from cameras installed on neighboring streets and intersections showed that the Nissan Altima was recorded traveling in the direction of the area where it was later found burned between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, i.e. Emming, on the same day Stephen disappeared. No video footage of the driver was obtained, but the recorded timestamps coincided with the time after Elizabeth was dropped off, when Stephen was supposed to leave the area. At the same time, the police interviewed residents in the area, focusing on the streets adjacent to the Dorsett's home. Several neighbors recalled seeing Stephen's car parked near the house on the morning of August 16 and noticing unusual activity near the garage of the Dorsett's home during that time. One local resident said she saw a car resembling a Nissan Altima parked near the Dorsett's house and then moved away, although such movement of cars was unusual at that time of the morning. The police recorded these statements to establish a timeline of events and check possible routes the car may have taken after visiting the house. Investigators began analyzing the relationship between Kathleen and Stephen, looking at their history, including their recent divorce and custody battle over Elizabeth. A review of court documents showed that Kathleen had been granted primary custody, but Stephen had the right to regular visits with his daughter, which led to discussions and agreements on visitation schedules. However, the divorce and alimony documents recorded disputes over Elizabeth's living expenses and mentioned plans by Kathleen and her parents, Thomas and Leslie Dorsett, to move to Florida, which could potentially complicate Stephen's access to his daughter. Namely, the police investigated the financial aspects of the case, checking bank transactions and documents to determine whether there were new sources of tension related to child support payments or agreements on financial support for the move that could have exacerbated underlying conflicts. Interviews with Stephen's friends and colleagues painted a general picture of his character and behavior. He did not express any open threats or grievances toward Kathleen, sought to maintain peaceful relations for the sake of his daughter, and was a man who avoided open conflict. At the same time, colleagues noted that in the weeks before his disappearance, Stephen had become more pensive and preoccupied, although he continued to work diligently and did not discuss personal problems in detail. Conversations with relatives revealed that he maintained regular contact with his daughter and was interested in maintaining access to Elizabeth despite the difficulties following the divorce. At the same time, forensic laboratories analyzed samples taken from the site where the car and body were found, including traces of flammable liquids, fragments of clothing, and microscopic biological traces that may have been left in the car. This data was necessary to confirm or refute possible hypotheses about who was driving the car at the time of its movement and who could have had contact with the car on the day of Stephen's disappearance. The work of systematizing all this data, combining telephone data, camera recordings, and eyewitness accounts, was used as the basis for constructing a complete chronology of events, which allowed the investigation to narrow down the circle of possible participants step by step and get closer to determining what actions led to the tragic consequences in this case. After forensic tests confirmed on August 2010 that the body found in the trunk of the burned-out Nissan Altima was that of Stephen Moore, investigators continued to gather evidence, relying on analysis of financial transactions, CCTV footage, telephone data, and witness statements to establish the full picture of the events that led to his death. It was discovered that microscopic traces of Stephen's blood were found on Kathleen Dorsett's clothing, confirmed by laboratory analysis. At the same time, during the examination of financial data, a payment of $3,000 from Thomas Dorsett to Anthony Morris was recorded, confirmed by bank statements and Anthony Morris's own admission that he had received the money for setting the car on fire, although he was unable to explain why he had done so before his arrest. The investigation established that on the morning of August 16, 2010, Stephen arrived at Kathleen's parents' home in Oakhurst to drop off his daughter Elizabeth, after which he ceased all communication. Surveillance cameras and neighbor testimony confirmed that Stephen's car was seen near the Dorsett's home and was later moved. According to the investigation, within the next few hours, Stephen's body was moved to a Nissan Altima belonging to Evelyn Moore, and then the car was driven to the Long Beach area, where it was subsequently set on fire to conceal evidence. The arson was carried out by Anthony Morris, who had been paid in advance, and had agreed to do the job without knowing the details of what was in the car at the time of the arson. During the investigation, the police started looking into the role of Leslie Dorsett, Thomas Dorsett's wife and Kathleen's mom. They found out that Leslie was involved in talking about plans to move the family to Florida, custody issues for Elizabeth, and what to do if Stephen didn't agree to move. An analysis of Leslie's phone calls and activities between August 16 and 18 revealed her contact with Kathleen and Thomas, as well as movements that coincided with the family's activities on the day of Stephen's disappearance. At this stage, the investigation did not yet have direct evidence of her involvement in the direct actions against Stephen, but began to consider Leslie as a person of interest, who could have facilitated the organization and cover-up of the action. After receiving information indicating Leslie's active involvement in discussing the actions to be taken after Stephen's disappearance and in concealing information, the police issued an arrest warrant. On August 25, 2010, Leslie Dorsett was arrested at her family's home in Oakhurst, joining Kathleen Dorsett, who had been arrested on August 23, and Thomas Dorsett, who had been arrested on the same day. Anthony Maurice was also arrested during this period and confirmed his role in the arson of the car. At the time of her arrest, Leslie remained calm, made no public statements, and was taken to the police station for questioning and processing. The investigation established that after Stephen's disappearance, the Dorsett family continued to discuss further steps, including the possible influence on the custody proceedings and maintaining control over Elizabeth. An analysis of the data revealed attempts to conceal part of the family's assets, amounting to $96,000, in order to prevent the seizure of property in the event of charges being brought, as well as evidence of attempts to discuss scenarios that would allow them to retain custody of Elizabeth without Stephen's involvement. These facts reinforce the investigation's suspicions regarding the deliberate and coordinated nature of the actions taken by members of the Dorsett family, although at this stage they did not contain a final legal assessment and remained part of the body of evidence being prepared for the case to be brought to court. At the same time, work was carried out to analyze all telephone calls made by Kathleen, Thomas, and Leslie Dorsett on the day of Stephen's disappearance and in the days that followed, in order to establish the sequence of discussions and determine what actions were taken to conceal what had happened. The prosecution and investigators also worked to establish a timeline of events based on witness statements, timestamps from surveillance cameras, and analysis of the movements of vehicles belonging to the Dorsett family to build a complete picture of the events that led to the tragic outcome. This stage ended with the formation of a basis for preparing the case for transfer to court. The prosecution prepared to build a legal case by systematizing expert reports, arrest reports, financial evidence, and technical analyses to create a comprehensive body of evidence. During this period, the police and the prosecution worked to prepare witnesses, draft indictments, and plan court hearings that would provide a legal assessment of the actions of each of the participants, answer questions from Stephen Moore's family and the public, and establish the legality and fairness of the case. After the preliminary investigations and preparation of indictments were completed, the case of Kathleen Dorsett, Thomas Dorsett, Leslie Dorsett, and Anthony Morris was transferred to Monmouth County Court, where the trial began in early 2013. The trial attracted considerable public interest as it centered on a family that had previously been well respected in the community and involved family conflicts, child custody issues, and the planning of actions that led to the tragic death of Stephen Moore. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence including forensic reports, phone records, bank transactions, and witness testimony that allowed them to build a coherent case. Evidence was presented showing that Stephen Moore arrived at Kathleen's parents' home on the morning of August 16, 2010, to hand over his daughter, after which he ceased all contact, and his body was later found in the trunk of his mother's burned-out car. The court heard evidence of microscopic traces of Stephen's blood on Kathleen's clothing, as well as a payment of $3,000.00 made to Thomas Dorsett Anthony Morris for setting fire to the car, which was confirmed by bank statements and Morris's own confession. The court focused on the financial and family background of the conflict between Kathleen and Stephen, discussing issues of custody of Elizabeth and the Dorsett family's plans to move to Florida, which would require Stephen to move to another state to maintain access to his daughter, as well as financial support from him during the first few months. This information illustrated the tension that existed between the former spouses and the motives that could have led to the planning of Stephen's removal from Kathleen's life and that of her family. During the hearings, witness testimony was presented, including from neighbors who noticed Stephen's car near the Dorsett's home on the day of his disappearance, as well as testimony from Anthony Morris, who confirmed that he had set fire to the car after receiving money from Thomas Dorsett. The court also heard telephone conversations between Kathleen, Thomas, and Leslie Dorsett, recorded in the days leading up to Stephen's disappearance and in the days that followed, which demonstrated the coordination of their actions in covering up what had happened. Separate discussions were held on episodes related to attempts by Leslie Dorsett and Kathleen Dorsett to organize subsequent actions to prevent Elizabeth from returning to Evelyn Moore, including discussions of possible actions against Stephen's mother. Kathleen, Thomas, and Leslie remained reserved during the hearings, refraining from making public comments in the courtroom and focusing on communicating with their lawyers. The court proceedings took place in a businesslike and orderly manner, with all participants in the proceedings being heard and the material evidence gathered during the investigation being presented. Stephen Moore's relatives and members of the public who were present in the courtroom observed the proceedings, awaiting the decision that would conclude the months-long trial. On May 17, 2013, the Monmouth County Court found Kathleen Dorsett guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder, sentencing her to 58 years in prison. Nicole Nikki Addimando was born on November 19, 1988, in a small town in New York State. Raised in a middle-class American family, she always had a close relationship with her parents. But despite this, her childhood was not easy. Her father worked in construction and her mother was a housewife. The family was loving and caring, but as Nicole grew older, she began to sense some tension in her parents' relationship, which partly affected her perception of the world. She was the youngest of 3 children and showed great aptitude for physical activity from an early age, especially gymnastics, which earned her the respect of her peers. Nicole graduated from high school with good grades, but her family could not afford the expensive university fees, so she enrolled at a local college where she studied education and psychology. Gymnastics, a passion she had known since childhood, remained her main hobby and one of her sources of confidence. She soon began teaching gymnastics at several fitness clubs, where she met Christopher Grover. They met in 2008. Nicole was 19 and Christopher was 21 when they started working together. Both were gymnastics coaches at a local fitness center. Despite Nicole being younger than Christopher, she felt comfortable and trusting around him. Their mutual attraction became apparent almost immediately. With their shared love of sports and healthy lifestyles, their relationship developed quickly, and they soon began dating. The couple looked happy, and their relationship developed into a serious commitment. A few years later, in 2012, when Nicole became pregnant, they decided to move together to Salt Point, a small community in New York. It was an important decision in their lives as they began to build their future together. With the birth of their first child in 2013, their relationship grew even stronger, and many loved ones expected that this would strengthen their marriage. Nicole saw these events as the beginning of a new phase in her life, full of happiness and hope for stability. Christopher seemed devoted to his family, and they both felt that only happy moments lay ahead. Nicole devoted herself to raising her son and continued to teach gymnastics. Christopher, although somewhat reserved, supported her in raising their children, and their life became measured and peaceful. However, 2 years later, in 2015, when their second child was born, which should have strengthened their family ties, the situation in the family began to change. It was then that the first signs appeared that their relationship would no longer be the same as before. Christopher began to display frequent aggression. Not only was he cold and distant, but he also often lashed out at Nicole. She felt that she was losing control of the situation, but did not know how to deal with it. The first incidents occurred when Nicole began to feel that her partner had become harsher and more aggressive. It started with small comments, but soon Christopher's behavior became more threatening. He began demanding sex from Nicole, and when she refused, he would verbally abuse her and threaten her with physical violence. She felt like she was losing herself and couldn't escape this vicious cycle. Christopher did not hide his dominance and gradually established complete control over her. At some point, he began filming her and posting the videos on various internet sites without her consent. These videos showed not only physical but also psychological abuse. Despite what was happening, Nicole did not dare to seek help. She was afraid that if she told anyone about what was happening, she would be accused of provoking the violence herself. She was also afraid of retaliation from Christopher, who often threatened her, saying that if she tried to escape, he would find her and kill her. Nicole tried to suppress her fear and continued to live with him, feeling her identity slip away with each passing day. In 2015, when Nicole tried to contact family services, she did not sign the documents because she feared that this would only increase the violence and lead to dangerous consequences for her children. Even after an affidavit describing the abuse was drawn up in November 2015, she did not dare to sign it. This was a time when Nicole was on the brink, and she felt that with each passing day she was losing her freedom and strength. The tragic day that became a turning point came on September 29, 2017. On that day, when Christopher was found dead in a house in Poughkeepsie, the situation became critical for Nicole. Christopher Grover's death in September 2017 was a pivotal moment in Nicole's life, turning her world upside down and calling all her actions into question. The investigation would later establish that this incident was not an accident, but the result of a long history of violence that led to a tragic end. On September 29, 2017, the day Christopher Grover's body was found, police arrived at the scene in Poughkeepsie, New York. The house where the tragedy occurred was located in a residential area of the city. Outwardly, the house looked normal, blending in with the other private homes. However, inside, the situation was completely different. It was a place that, as it turned out, had been hiding a long history of violence and fear that ended in tragedy. Law enforcement officers arriving at the scene found Grover's body lying on the sofa in the living room. He was dressed in everyday clothes, as if he had been sitting and relaxing when something happened. The blood covering the sofa and floor in the room testified to the severity of the man's injuries. However, at first glance, it was strange that there were no signs of a struggle. This alerted investigators. The lack of resistance or attempts to defend himself left questions that were not immediately clear. Grover did not try to escape or even defend himself, which could mean that he did not expect an attack or was unable to resist. According to a preliminary examination of the body, Grover's death was caused by a gunshot wound to the chest. However, upon closer inspection, the circumstances seemed less clear-cut. Autopsy experts determined that the shot was fired at close range, which could indicate that Grover was relaxed or even half asleep. This was consistent with the testimony of Nicole Addimando, who claimed that the shot was fired while Christopher was sitting on the couch and not expecting an attack. In addition, a weapon was found at the scene, but it did not belong to Grover. It was registered to Nicole, which contrasted sharply with the initial testimony. Nicole stated that she did not know how the weapon ended up in the house, even though it was right in the room where the tragedy occurred. The weapon was found next to Grover's body, but not in his hands. Fingerprints found on the weapon identified it as hers. This deviation from the standard pattern of events raised additional questions for investigators. The unusual position of the body, the lack of signs of a struggle, and the weapon found in the hands of the other party led investigators to seriously consider the cause of Grover's death. Initial assumptions of self-defense were ruled out by the lack of signs of resistance on Grover's body. While in similar cases, one would often expect to find at least minor signs of a struggle or attempts to avoid the attack, in this case it appeared as if Grover had been sitting on the sofa at the moment of the shot, not expecting any threat. Forensic experts who examined the scene confirmed that Grover did not attempt to resist or defend himself. He had no signs of a struggle, such as bruises or scratches, which usually appear in cases of resistance. He was not heavily armed and was not in a position that would have allowed him to prepare for defense. Some experts expressed the opinion that if Grover had been somewhat prepared for the attack, he could probably have defended himself, or at least warned of the possible threat. On the other hand, when investigators began examining the house itself, they found that it was somewhat neglected. Some personal items such as clothing and personal documents were scattered around the room, indicating a possible moment of severe stress. The absence of obvious signs of a struggle in the house did not rule out the possibility that domestic violence was a chronic occurrence. This was a turning point, as investigators began to suspect that the cause of the incident might lie in the long-term relationship between Addimando and Grover, in which violence and threats had become commonplace. After investigating the couple's personal life, the police learned that Nicole and Christopher's relationship was far from ideal. It became clear that their relationship was fraught with tension and hidden violence. This was confirmed by statements from neighbors and colleagues who said they often heard arguments and screams coming from their home. Particularly striking were the stories of sudden changes in Christopher's behavior, who, according to people, sometimes became overly aggressive and domineering. Investigators began gathering information about what had been happening in the home prior to the tragedy. It was established that the couple had been called to the police several times for domestic disputes, but there were no official reports of domestic violence. Problems with alcohol and aggression in the relationship were not documented, but neighbors' observations showed that tensions were growing. Thus, there was little room for illusions about what had happened. The investigation continued for several days, and investigators began to look at the events from a different angle. From the moment they found the weapon registered to Nicole, it became clear that the case was not as simple as it had initially appeared. Questions about how the weapon ended up in the victim's hands and why she apparently did not try to escape or defend herself became the focus of the investigators. Ultimately, the investigation into this case provided a complete picture of the relationship between Addimando and Grover. Police and prosecutors began gathering all available evidence to determine what really happened in the house on that fateful day. With each new fact and piece of evidence, suspicions began to grow. When the police began investigating Christopher Grover's death, special attention was paid to questioning his partner, Nicole Addimando. At first glance, her testimony seemed quite plausible. She claimed that a conflict had arisen between her and her partner, during which she shot him in self-defense. According to her, Grover threatened her with a gun, and she was forced to act to protect her life. Initially, Addimando's testimony did not raise any strong suspicions among investigators. Her story contained enough details for the police to accept her version as plausible. She described how, after another argument, when Grover, according to her, began to threaten her and tried to attack her, she panicked, grabbed a gun to defend herself, and fired. However, investigators gradually began to notice that her explanations were becoming increasingly contradictory. A more detailed analysis of her testimony revealed some inconsistencies. During questioning, Nicole initially stated that the shot was fired when Grover threatened her with a gun, but when investigators began analyzing her version of events, she changed her story, claiming that she actually fired the shot when Grover was in a relaxed position, sitting on the couch. This discrepancy in her testimony immediately caught the attention of investigators. While Addimando's initial claim that her partner had threatened her with a gun could have been seen as logical in the context of her alleged self-defense, the subsequent change in her story suggested that the defendant's version may not have been the whole picture. Investigators began digging deeper, trying to figure out what could have been behind the murder. They soon discovered that Addimando and Grover had serious relationship problems. For several years, their life had been full of tension and hidden violence. An important turning point came when the police began gathering information about the couple's personal lives. Statements from neighbors, acquaintances, and colleagues began to paint a very different picture from the one Addimando was trying to present. Some witnesses reported hearing loud arguments between the couple on multiple occasions. According to neighbors, these conflicts often escalated to shouting, and there were clear signs of aggression on both sides. In particular, employees at the local fitness center where Nicole worked mentioned that she often seemed tense and anxious. Her co-workers said that Nicole did not hide her fear of her partner, but despite this, she never sought help from the police. Nicole tried several times to avoid talking about her personal life, but she did eventually tell a friend about how Christopher abused her. It soon became clear that Grover's behavior left Nicole feeling completely helpless. Her statements increasingly showed signs of fear, paranoia, and despair. These emotional states were reflected in her accounts of what happened that day. She said she couldn't do anything but defend herself. However, inconsistencies in her statements about the incident itself continued to raise concerns. Upon closer examination, it was discovered that the gun used in the murder was registered to Nicole, which became another important element of the investigation. At this point, investigators began to piece together a complete picture of what had happened at the Addimando and Grover home. Through interviews and analysis of personal materials such as emails, text messages, and even photos and videos, it was determined that Grover had systematically threatened his partner. Some of these threats were extremely violent and directed not only at Nicole, but also at her loved ones. The relationship between them had become so toxic that it seemed the only way out for Nicole was to end the cycle of violence. On top of that, it was difficult for her to find a way out of this vicious circle without putting herself at even greater risk. However, the surprises that investigators encountered during the investigation did not end there. It became clear that in the weeks leading up to the murder, Christopher Grover had become increasingly aggressive, according to several people. His behavior became more unpredictable and dangerous. These changes were noticeable even to his colleagues and acquaintances, who began to notice that he often lost his temper and showed signs of instability. This reinforced the hypothesis that the murder may have been the result of years of pressure and violence that Nicole had been trying to cope with, rather than a random conflict. After gathering this information, investigators began to suspect that Nicole's self-defense story might not tell the whole story of what happened in the house. This led them to look at possible motives and how long her life had been in danger. With each new piece of evidence, investigators realized that this case was much more complicated than it initially appeared. The question of what had happened between Addimando and Grover became key to uncovering the truth and understanding what might have actually caused this tragedy. In the end, despite contradictions in her testimony, Nicole continued to insist that her actions were motivated by self-defense. However, investigators were increasingly inclined to believe that her actions were not only motivated by self-defense, but also by a deep personal drama that she had been experiencing for several years. During the investigation, it became clear that the relationship between Nicole Addimando and Christopher Grover was extremely painful and at times violent. With each new interrogation and piece of evidence gathered, investigators began to uncover a frightening picture of the couple's life, which at first glance seemed normal. However, as more became known about the personal relationship between Addimando and Grover, as well as what was happening in their home, investigators became increasingly aware that the tragedy that occurred on September 29, 2017, was the result of years of abuse, psychological and physical terror. In addition, investigators soon discovered that Grover did not limit himself to physical violence but also psychologically controlled his partner. Digging through the correspondence found on Addimando's phone, they came across numerous threats that Grover had sent her over several years. His messages included phrases such as that she would not be able to leave him and that if she tried, he would find her and kill her. These threats became more than just words, they became frequent actions. Grover systematically threw tantrums and started fights, making Nicole feel helpless and trapped in the relationship. In addition to this evidence, investigators found evidence confirming that Addimando had tried to escape this cycle of violence. She told friends and colleagues about what was happening in her family, but often kept the exact details to herself, fearing retaliation from Grover. Several witnesses, including co-workers, mentioned that Nicole came to work with bruises and looked depressed, but did not disclose the reason. One of her close friends, with whom she shared some of her experiences, later confirmed that she had told her about the systematic abuse by Christopher, but did not dare to go to the police because she was afraid that she would not be taken seriously or that she would be accused of provoking the violence. The next discovery made by investigators drew attention to a weapon found at the crime scene. It turned out to be registered to Addimando, which immediately cast doubt on the initial testimony. Nicole claimed that the weapon belonged to her and that she had used it solely for self-defense, But the fact that the gun was found next to Grover's body and not in his hands was an important piece of evidence that cast doubt on her initial version of events. This weapon became central evidence that Grover's death was not accidental, but most likely the result of Addimando's actions. When the police began gathering additional information about the family, investigators stumbled upon records made earlier. Photos were found on one of Grover's devices showing him committing acts of violence against his partner. These photos, taken without her consent, showed various degrees of humiliation and violence. Some of them depicted Nicole with her face covered or with visible signs of beatings. These photos were posted online and caused Nicole even deeper humiliation, which undoubtedly affected her psychological state. Elements of psychological abuse, such as public humiliation and extortion through threats, only increased the pressure on Nicole. And investigators began to understand that her actions may have been the result of chronic depression and stress. During the course of the investigation, investigators determined that Grover had become even more aggressive in the last weeks of his life. He was often unemployed and may have been suffering from financial problems. Nicole said that his emotional state had deteriorated and he had become more unpredictable. Ultimately, this also influenced her decision. She was faced with a choice of what to do to survive in a situation of constant abuse. Based on all the evidence gathered, including threatening messages, photos of violence, and the weapon found, investigators concluded that Christopher Grover's death was the result of systematic domestic violence and the actions of his partner, who at some point decided that her life was in danger and that the only way out was to act. This led investigators to conclude that Nicole Addimando was indeed capable of committing murder, but that her actions were likely motivated by long-term stress and threats from Grover. On October 3, 2017, a few days after the evidence was gathered, the decision was made to arrest Nicole. Police detained her at her home, and she was soon formally arrested on charges of murder. This event was a turning point in the investigation, as the court now had to decide whether she could be considered a victim of violence acting under extreme stress and threat, or whether she committed the crime while of sound mind and aware of her actions at the time. Nicole Addimando's arrest was the culmination of an investigation into the case that attracted the attention of not only law enforcement agencies but also the public. Many people began to wonder whether her actions could be justified on the basis of the years of abuse she had suffered, or whether she should be held responsible for the murder, regardless of the reason for her action. After Nicole Addimando was arrested on October 3, 2017, the case of her involvement in the murder of Christopher Grover went to trial. The trial attracted a lot of public attention because it combined issues of domestic violence, self-defense, and justice. The investigation continued for several months, and in January 2018, the trial began. The trial began with a thorough analysis of the circumstances of the crime, the defendant's testimony, and the evidence presented. During the trial, the prosecution presented a series of testimonies confirming the years of abuse Addimando had suffered at the hands of her partner. Based on this evidence, the prosecution sought to convince the court that the murder was not a random act, but rather the result of years of emotional and physical abuse. The defense attorneys focused on portraying Nicole as a victim of abuse who was forced to act under constant threat. They referred to the defendant's psychological state, arguing that years of abuse had led her to a state of psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which could have affected her perception of the situation at the time of the crime. The defense argued that Nicole acted in a moment of stress, unaware of the seriousness of her action. It was also emphasized that she had no other choice, as she was in danger of being killed by Grover. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that the crime was not the result of self-defense, but rather a planned act of revenge. Prosecutors emphasized that the lack of signs of a struggle, as well as the weapon found registered in Nicole's name, indicated that Grover's death was not accidental but premeditated. They pointed out that at the time of the murder, Grover was not in a position to threaten Addimando's life, which cast doubt on the self-defense version. The trial lasted several months. During the proceedings, various witnesses were heard, including Nicole's colleagues, who confirmed her experiences of violence at the hands of Grover. Information was also presented about several episodes of violence in their relationship, as well as video recordings showing Grover's humiliation and abuse. Particular attention was paid to psychological evaluations. The experts confirmed that Nicole suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and that years of abuse had had a significant impact on her mental health. This was an important element in the case, as the defense used these findings to demonstrate that Nicole's actions were dictated by her psychological state and not by malicious intent. The experts also claimed that Grover's constant threats and aggression led Nicole to feel that her life was in danger, which could have influenced her decision at the time of the tragedy. However, prosecutors objected, arguing that despite signs of past violence, there was insufficient evidence that Grover had actually threatened Addimando on that day. They pointed to inconsistencies in her testimony, as well as the fact that Grover did not resist, which could indicate that the shot was fired when he was unable to resist. This also cast doubt on the defendant's claim that her actions were motivated by self-defense. The trial attracted public attention as it touched on important social issues such as domestic violence, victims' rights, and justice. Many women supporting Nicole signed petitions in her defense, and the case attracted the attention of human rights organizations, which insisted that victims of domestic violence should be able to receive leniency in sentencing if their actions were motivated by long-term abuse. On February 16, 2018, a court in Poughkeepsie, New York, found Nicole Addimando guilty of second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. The court found that the defendant had killed her partner, but despite evidence of years of abuse against her, the court found that Addimando's actions were not entirely justified by self-defense. The court noted that despite her traumatic state, at the time of the crime she had the opportunity to avoid violence and possibly leave the scene rather than using a weapon to eliminate the threat. On March 6, 2018, Nicole Addimando was sentenced to 19 years in prison on charges of second-degree murder. This decision was based on the seriousness of the crime, as well as the court's decision that her actions did not fully fall under the category of self-defense. Although the court took into account her condition after years of abuse, the decisive factor was that she did not take other measures to avoid violence. Donna Moonda was born in 1951 to South Asian immigrants who settled in Pennsylvania in search of a better life. From childhood, Ghulam stood out for his diligence and perseverance, qualities that helped him achieve impressive success in his studies and career. He was the eldest of 3 children and helped his parents from an early age, working after school and on weekends. Ghulam's education was outstanding. He graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with honors and then went on to medical school, specializing in cardiology. His hard work and sincere desire to help people made him a respected doctor in the medical community of Western Pennsylvania. Many patients appreciated his attention and professionalism, and his colleagues respected him for his thoroughness and ethics in his work. In the early 1980s, Ghulam met Donna, a young woman from a neighboring town, who immediately won him over with her warm personality and sharp mind. Their acquaintance was almost fairy tale-like. At a party with mutual friends, a spark flew between them that turned into a strong bond over the years. They soon married and began building a life together. Ghulam and Donna's marriage lasted almost 20 years. During that time, they had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in an atmosphere of love and care. The family lived in a cozy house in the suburbs where relatives and friends often gathered. Despite Ghulam's busy schedule at the hospital, he always tried to find time for his family. On weekends, they went on picnics, celebrated holidays, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Like many families, the Moons had their difficulties. Sometimes there were disagreements, sometimes about work, sometimes about little things. Donna and Ghulam did not always understand each other perfectly, and sometimes their discussions turned into arguments. But overall, they saw these moments as a natural part of family life, something that periodically arises and then subsides without leaving deep wounds. They both understood that family relationships require work and patience, and that love sometimes requires compromise. Donna took care of the household and raised the children, but she also found time for her hobbies, reading, gardening, and meeting with close friends. Despite his busy schedule as a doctor, Ghulam tried to be a source of support for his wife and children. Their life flowed smoothly and seemed quite happy from the outside. The family's financial situation was stable. As a successful doctor, Ghulam provided his family with everything they needed: a comfortable home, a quality education for their children, travel, and a comfortable lifestyle. They had savings and real estate, which gave them confidence in the future. The early morning of May 10, 2005 began as usual, calm, clear, and filled with the freshness of spring air. At around 5:30 a.m., Donna woke up earlier than usual to prepare breakfast and help the children get ready for school. Ghulam, as usual, was already ready for his day at work, full of plans and tasks at the hospital. The house was filled with quiet bustle, the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the muffled voices of children getting ready for school, and the alarm clock reminding everyone that a new day had begun. At 6 a.m., the streets in the suburbs were still half empty, and the city was just beginning to wake up from its night's sleep. At around 6:30 a.m., Ghulam left his house, got into his car, and headed toward Ohio Turnpike to drive to the hospital. The road was deserted, typical for an early morning on a weekday. The weather was clear and the air was cool and fresh. At approximately 6:55 a.m., a dark car appeared on the empty stretch of road. No one knew who was behind the wheel or what the driver's motive was. A few minutes later, at around 7:00 a.m., a shot rang out, sharp and precise. The bullet hit its target, Dr. Donna Moonda, who was behind the wheel. The driver of the unknown car quickly left the scene, leaving behind silence and alarm. Only Dr. Ghulam's car remained on the road with its wounded owner inside. Less than 10 minutes later, road workers were passing by. They noticed the car standing on the side of the road with the door open and saw the body inside. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, one of the workers immediately dialed 911 to report the incident. The workers waited for the ambulance and police to arrive. They remained at the scene, helping to ensure safety, directing arriving vehicles, and trying not to disturb the evidence before the investigators arrived. The incident on this deserted stretch of road shook the entire region. The early morning silence was shattered by a sudden act of violence, the perpetrator and motive of which were still unknown. The police arrived at the scene and began examining and cordoning off the area. Officers immediately marked the perimeter of the incident to prevent unauthorized access and preserve all evidence in its original state. The area on Ohio Turnpike where Dr. Donna Moonda's car was found had some distinctive features. It was a straight and relatively secluded stretch of road, surrounded by thick brush and woods on one side and open fields on the other. It was here, in this quiet and little visited place, that the tragic incident occurred. The police carefully recorded all the details of the scene. First, numerous photographs were taken from different angles: the position of the car, the condition of the doors, the distribution of shell casings on the roadside, and the marks on the ground. Experts documented every detail that could help in the further investigation. Particular attention was paid to the location of the vehicle. Dr. Moonda's car was parked at the very edge of the road, the driver's door was ajar, and the body was inside. The position of the car on the road indicated a sudden stop, which is not typical for a normal trip on a highway. The bullet casings found at the scene shed light on the circumstances of the crime. 4 .38 caliber bullet casings were found in close proximity to each other. Ballistic analysis later confirmed that they had all been fired from the same weapon. Their exact location made it possible to determine the direction of the shots and the approximate position of the shooter. In addition, shoe prints were found at the scene that did not match those of the victim or the road workers who first discovered the body. These prints probably belonged to the perpetrator and provided investigators with an important lead. Their shape and size helped narrow down the search. A piece of fabric found on the branches of a bush near the scene was an equally important clue. The material and color matched the description of the clothing the suspect was wearing on the day of the murder, according to witness interviews and observations. Road workers who first discovered the body said that they had not noticed anything suspicious on that section of the road in the evening before the incident, but in the morning, they found a car with an open door and an unresponsive driver. They immediately called the police and an ambulance, which allowed the investigation to begin quickly and minimized the risk of evidence being damaged. Officers noted that the section of road had a limited number of possible approaches and escape routes, which helped them orient themselves in their search for the suspect. However, due to the remoteness of the location and the lack of CCTV cameras, the investigation was complicated by the absence of direct video evidence. In addition, experts noted the absence of signs of a struggle on the body and inside the car, indicating that the attack was sudden. The car had no visible damage, except for a bullet hole in the driver's door, which reinforced the theory of a carefully planned ambush. The police conducted a thorough search of the roadside and surrounding areas, looking for any items or traces that could be linked to the crime. Several cigarette butts were found, which were subsequently subjected to chemical analysis, as well as an empty drink bottle, possibly left behind by the suspect. Investigators also studied the route taken by the victim and recorded the details of his daily movements. Analysis showed that the perpetrator was likely familiar with the victim's schedule and habits, indicating prior preparation and planning. During the examination of the crime scene, experts noted that this particular section of the road was chosen because of its seclusion, which minimized the risk of accidental witnesses. In addition, there were no external light sources that could have helped the perpetrator escape in the dark after committing the crime. Special attention was paid to possible traces of the suspect's vehicle. Tire prints were found on the dirt shoulder that did not match the victim's car. This suggested that the perpetrator had arrived in another car, parked on the shoulder, and then quickly left the scene of the crime. Although the streets in this area were rarely patrolled, the police interviewed local residents and road service employees in an attempt to identify possible witnesses or individuals who had been seen nearby at the critical time. None of them had noticed anything suspicious, which made the investigation even more difficult. The overall picture gathered at the crime scene indicated that the perpetrator was highly skilled and cold-blooded. The police understood that in order to successfully solve the case, they would need to carefully compare the evidence and testimonies, as well as use modern forensic methods. The first few days after the incident were devoted to collecting and analyzing evidence from the crime scene. Every little detail, from fingerprints to scraps of fabric, could be crucial in finding the culprit. From that moment on, the investigators began the complex and multifaceted work of piecing together the complete picture of what had happened. After the tragic murder of Dr. Donna Moonda, investigators immediately realized that the case would require maximum concentration and in-depth analysis. Initial suspicions were based on a thorough examination of the crime scene and the evidence collected. The police knew that this was not a random crime, but a carefully planned act. The victim's car was parked on the side of the road. The driver's door was ajar, and inside lay a body with no signs of a struggle. Everything pointed to a sudden attack. These details suggested to investigators that the perpetrator was familiar with the doctor's daily routine and took advantage of a moment when he was at his most vulnerable. However, despite the obviousness of the initial assumptions, the path to solving the case proved to be difficult and multifaceted. An important breakthrough came when investigators gained access to the cell phone of Donna Moonda, the victim's wife. It was there that they found the information that led them to the suspect. Donna's correspondence with Damien Bradford, which was extracted from the phone, proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. The messages contained not just personal confessions and romantic phrases, they revealed collusion and planning of the crime. In the texts, Donna affectionately called Bradford Daddy, and he responded to her as little girl. In addition to intimate language, the correspondence included discussions of details that pointed to preparations for the murder. They exchanged information about the time and place, discussed methods and consequences, which clearly linked them to the crime. The police analyzed the timestamps of the messages in detail and found that the active communication between Donna and Bradford took place in the period immediately preceding the tragedy. This data became one of the cornerstones of the investigation. The existence of correspondence with such content allowed investigators to focus their attention on these two as the main suspects. This was followed by interviews with relatives, friends, and colleagues of the victim and his wife. Witnesses said that the Moonda family, like any other, had its ups and downs. Donna and Golem, according to them, were experiencing normal family difficulties, disagreements, unresolved issues, temporary quarrels. However, none of their loved ones could have imagined that something much darker was developing between them. People noted that Donna was quite secretive, rarely sharing her thoughts and plans, and her affair with Bradford remained a secret to those around her for a long time. The name Damien Bradford first came up in phone records and witness statements. Bradford was a man with a criminal past who lived near the Moons family and had already been convicted of violent crimes. This information made him the main figure in the investigation. Investigators carefully examined all his contacts and connections, revealing a close relationship with Donna, who had not previously attracted the attention of the police. Technical expertise became a key link in the chain of evidence. DNA analysis conducted on fabric fragments found at the crime scene matched samples from Bradford. These traces could not be dismissed as coincidental. They were clear evidence of his physical presence. Ballistics confirmed that all the shell casings found at the scene had been fired from the gun that was later seized from Bradford. This combination of the weapon and the evidence significantly strengthened the investigation's case. An important element was the examination of the suspect's phone records. An analysis of calls and messages allowed investigators to reconstruct their routes and times of travel. Bradford appeared repeatedly in the area where the murder took place, and he and Donna were in constant contact discussing plans and details. This evidence pointed not to a chance encounter but to a deliberate and premeditated conspiracy. The motive for the crime also played a significant role. The investigation revealed that Donna was seeking access to a large inheritance that was to pass to her and her children after Gulamunda's death. The estate was estimated to be worth millions of dollars and included real estate and large cash deposits. Donna was in a difficult financial situation and in a relationship with Bradford, who, having no stable income, was interested in financial support. Correspondence showed that Donna had promised Bradford a significant share of the property in exchange for carrying out the plan. Interrogations of the suspects revealed interesting details. Donna initially refused to admit her guilt, trying to deny any criminal intent. However, under the weight of the evidence and witness testimony, her position weakened. Bradford confessed to directly participating in the murder, but claimed that he was acting on Donna's orders. Their statements ultimately coincided, confirming their collusion and mutual interest. The investigation also analyzed the suspect's movements and communications in the days leading up to the crime. This allowed investigators to reconstruct a detailed timeline. Donna and Bradford actively coordinated their actions, choosing a time and place that was convenient and, in their view, as safe as possible for carrying out their plan. The investigation was fraught with difficulties. The lack of direct witnesses, video recordings, and some key pieces of evidence made the task much more difficult. However, thanks to the coordinated work of forensic experts, careful examination of digital traces, and thorough collection of testimony, it was possible to piece together a complete picture. Modern methods of DNA analysis, ballistics, and forensic expertise played an important role. The police also faced attempts by the suspects to cover their tracks. Attempts to hide or destroy correspondence and messages were discovered, but digital traces remained. Analysis of data on servers and in cloud storage helped to recover deleted files and prove the connection. The operation to arrest Donna Moonda and Damien Bradford was a key step in solving the murder of Dr. Ghulam Moonda. After months of gathering evidence, analyzing correspondence, phone data, and technical expertise, law enforcement had enough to take action. Donna was arrested in July 2006, more than a year after the tragedy. On that day, FBI agents arrived at her home in Hermitage, Mercer County. Donna greeted them with visible distress. Surprise and shock were evident on her face, but she tried to remain calm. Police officers presented her with an arrest warrant and explained the charges against her. after which she was taken to the station for further processing. Damien Bradford was arrested at the same time as Donna in the area where he lived. His arrest was conducted under heavy surveillance, given his criminal history and the potential danger he might pose. At the time of his arrest, Bradford remained defiant but did not attempt to resist. He understood the seriousness of the situation and probably anticipated the inevitability of his arrest. After the arrest of Donna Moonda and Damien Bradford, the investigation moved into a phase of intensive questioning, which became a key stage in the investigation. Both suspects were isolated and taken in for questioning one at a time, where they were given the opportunity to present their version of events. From the very beginning of the interrogation, Bradford showed a willingness to cooperate. He admitted his involvement in the murder of Dr. Moonda, giving a detailed account of his participation. Bradford described how and when the attack was planned, what precautions were taken, and how he fired the shots. His testimony matched the evidence and testimony gathered, which significantly strengthened its credibility. However, the most important and dramatic moment of the interrogation was Bradford's admission that after receiving the agreed amount of money, he had not initially planned to stay with Donna Moonda. He openly stated that he intended to break off the relationship and leave, starting a new life apart from her. This confession shocked not only the investigators but also Donna herself, who was present during the interrogation either in the next room or in the same room under observation. When Bradford's words about his intention to leave Donna after committing the crime reached her, her emotional state deteriorated sharply. She began to cry, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. It was obvious that these words had shaken her to the core. One couldn't help but feel that for Donna, this confession was not only confirmation of betrayal, but also a painful blow to the hopes and feelings she had harbored for Bradford. Her tears and inner turmoil became one of the most vivid and memorable episodes of the interrogation. At that moment, the human side of the tragedy was revealed. Behind the criminal plan and the murder were feelings, deception, and betrayal. This became important psychological evidence, highlighting the complexity and multifaceted nature of what had happened. For investigators, this moment was not only emotional but also informative. Bradford's confession helped to better understand the dynamics of the relationship between the suspects, their motivation, and the details of the plan. It also strengthened the evidence base, confirming that the murder was carefully planned and carried out as part of a conspiracy. Bradford's testimony confirmed many details known to the investigation. He described the location and time of the attack, how Dr. Moonda's car was stopped, and the circumstances surrounding the shots. This information matched the evidence found, which strengthened the credibility of his statements. One of the key pieces of evidence found on Damien Bradford was his personal car, which was seized during a search after his arrest. This car attracted the attention of investigators immediately after it was examined. Experts noted that the tires on this car matched the tire prints found at the crime scene. It was these prints on the dirt shoulder near the spot where Dr. Moonda was shot that initially became one of the important clues for forensic experts. During a detailed examination of the car, experts conducted a comparative analysis of the tire treads. The prints taken from the crime scene had unique characteristics, tread depth, shape, and wear that were virtually impossible to reproduce on another car by accident. A comparison with the tires of Bradford's car showed that all these parameters matched perfectly. This meant that it was this car that the perpetrator used to drive to the crime scene and then quickly leave it. The very fact that this particular car was found and its connection to the crime scene confirmed significantly strengthened the case against Bradford. This evidence became one of the central pieces in the case, as it not only confirmed his presence at the right time and place, but also showed that the suspect's actions had been planned and coordinated in advance. In addition, a gun was seized from Bradford, which was later subjected to ballistic analysis. Experts confirmed that this was the weapon used to kill Dr. Moonda. The bullets recovered at the scene matched the shots fired from this gun. This was further irrefutable evidence of Bradford's involvement in the crime. The arrest of Donna and Bradford came as a shock and bewilderment to their relatives and loved ones. For many, It came as a complete surprise. No one could imagine that Donna, who seemed like a quiet, family-oriented woman, could be involved in such a horrific crime. Relatives struggled to accept the accusations, expressing doubts and grief. They tried to find explanations and understand what could have led to such an outcome. During the investigation, close family members testified that there were no signs of such a crime in their circle, and that only Donna and Bradford, whose relationship had been secret for a long time, had behaved suspiciously. These testimonies were important in forming a complete picture of the case. After all investigative measures were completed, Donna Moon and Damian Bradford were officially charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The charges also included planning and executing the crime for financial gain. From that point on, the case moved to the trial stage. The entire story of the arrests and charges caused a widespread public outcry and media coverage. County residents and acquaintances of the family watched the developments with surprise and concern, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. The trial was expected to be one of the most high-profile cases in the region. After months of thorough investigation and the filing of official charges against Donna Moonda and Damian Bradford, the case was transferred to the federal court in Mercer County. The trial immediately attracted public and media attention, becoming one of the most high-profile and controversial cases in the region's history. The trial went beyond a typical criminal case, as it involved not only murder but also family betrayal, secret conspiracies, and a significant financial motive, which caused widespread public outrage. The role of the lawyers and the defense of the accused proved to be crucial in the trial. Donna Moonda and Damian Bradford received skilled legal support. Each was represented by experienced criminal law specialists who made every effort to defend their clients. The lawyers carefully analyzed all the evidence presented by the prosecution, seeking to identify gaps and contradictions. The main weapon of the defense was an attempt to mitigate the guilt of the defendants and cast doubt on the nature of their involvement in the crime. Donna Moon's defense focused primarily on presenting her as a victim of circumstances rather than an active organizer. The lawyers tried to prove that the evidence against her was circumstantial and that her correspondence with Bradford could have been taken out of context or misinterpreted. They also pointed out that Donna had no direct physical involvement in the crime and attempted to discredit key witness testimony, particularly Bradford's own confession, suggesting that he may have lied to protect himself. Damian Bradford's defense attorneys, in turn, focused the jury's attention on their client's complex and ambiguous past. They emphasized his psychological state and motives, eliciting sympathy from the audience and attempting to explain his actions as the result of pressure and manipulation by Donna Moonda. Bradford was portrayed as a performer who had been trapped by circumstances. The trial began in early 2007 in federal court in Mercer County. The courtroom was packed with jurors, prosecutors, lawyers for both sides, defendants, witnesses, and numerous media representatives. The atmosphere was tense, as not only the fate of two individuals was at stake, but also the principle of justice. Prosecutors prepared a powerful indictment based on extensive evidence. This included a detailed analysis of correspondence between Donna Moonda and Damian Bradford, which contained discussions about murder plans, the distribution of inheritance, and details of the crime. DNA test results confirming Bradford's physical presence at the scene were also presented, as well as ballistics tests linking the weapon used to fire the shot to Bradford himself. In addition, the court heard testimony from witnesses, including police officers, forensic experts, relatives, and acquaintances of the defendants. This testimony helped to piece together a picture of the events, confirm technical details, and reveal the suspect's motives. Of particular significance were Bradford's confessions, in which he described in detail how he carried out the murder, as well as his relationship with Donna, her role in organizing the crime, and his own plans for the future. The prosecution emphasized that Donna Moonda was not a passive participant. On the contrary, the prosecution portrayed her as the initiator and main coordinator of the conspiracy. According to the prosecution, she carefully planned her husband's murder, hoping to gain significant financial benefit. Bradford acted as the perpetrator who, despite his personal intention to leave Donna after the crime, was well aware of the seriousness and consequences of his actions. In response, the defense attempted to break down the charge into its constituent parts, emphasizing the lack of direct evidence of Donna's physical involvement in the crime, questioning Bradford's motives, and focusing on the unreliability of some of the evidence and witnesses. The lawyers tried to show that the case contained a lot of circumstantial evidence and therefore could not serve as the basis for a harsh sentence. The trial proceeded with intense hearings over several months. The parties carefully examined every detail, conducted cross-examinations, and presented and refuted evidence. The jury closely followed the proceedings, analyzed the arguments and contradictions, and weighed the facts and testimony. On November 15, 2007, the Mercer County Federal Court found Donna Moonda guilty of conspiracy to murder and the murder of her husband, Dr. Ghulam Moonda. On the same day, the court sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On November 15, 2007, the federal court in Mercer County found Damian Bradford guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Bradford was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. Robert Limon was born on March 4, 1983, in a small town in California. From his childhood, he was characterized by his sociability and friendliness. He was a cheerful teenager who always found a common language with others. Robert had a large circle of friends, and those who knew him spoke about him as a person who can be trusted, who is always ready to help and support. His parents, David and Janet Limon, raised him in an atmosphere of respect and hard work. The family was not wealthy, but they lived quite comfortably, always low-key, with love and care. Robert graduated from the local high school, where he was one of the popular students. He actively participated in school activities and was also passionate about sports and technology. His dream was to become a firefighter, like many boys, because the profession was associated with risk, heroism, and the opportunity to help people. But as he grew up, he realized that the path to this dream could be long and require a lot of effort and sacrifice. Therefore, without giving up hope, Robert decided to take a more practical step and got a job at the local railroad shop. However, his life was not limited to work and study. It was at this point, at the age of 22, that Robert met a girl named Sabrina. They met at a mutual friend's wedding, where Robert immediately caught Sabrina's attention with his confidence and charm. She was intelligent, independent, and a very charismatic woman. Their conversations at first sight appeared easy and casual. Robert listened to her with interest, and she could feel herself beginning to grow attached to him with every word. Sabrina was a couple of years younger than Robert, but that didn't hinder their relationship. She was born and raised in a neighboring town, and her life had been tied to the Christian faith since she was a little girl. After graduating from college, she got a job too, at a local church, where her role involved organizing activities for the youth and helping the congregation. This was a surprising discovery for Robert. Sabrina was a strong woman who believed very strongly in God, and with that came the ability to maintain and nurture relationships. This quality of hers was what at one point caught his attention and captured his heart. The couple began dating, and their relationship grew rapidly. They both believed that they had met their soulmate. 2 years after meeting, Robert proposed to Sabrina to become his wife. It was an exciting and beautiful proposal. On an evening walk in the park, under the stars, Robert got down on one knee and asked for her hand in marriage. Sabrina, without hesitation, agreed. The wedding took place in 1929 in a small but very solemn ceremony with the presence of family and friends. Their relationship was strong and stable from the beginning. As a young family, they lived in the Silver Lakes area of California, which was the perfect place for them, a small but very cozy community where everyone knew and supported each other. Robert and Sabrina became the parents of 2 children, a son Joshua and a daughter Emily. The Limon family was full of love, care, and support. The children grew up in a supportive environment, surrounded by their parents' attention, and in an atmosphere of Christian values. Throughout the years, their lives seemed perfect. Robert continued to work as a mechanic at the local railroad station, which brought in a steady income. It was a job he loved, despite the fact that his dream of becoming a firefighter was never realized. He found fulfillment in his career, knowing that his labor was important to others and that he was part of the machinery that kept the country moving. Sabrina, for her part, was actively involved in her community. She organized volunteer projects and events, always stayed focused on helping people. While working at the church, she was one of those people who could always be called upon for advice and support. Despite their busy lives, the family always found time to relax together. Every Sunday they spent the day together, often going outdoors or attending family dinners with friends. Robert and Sabrina were an example to others, showing that it was possible to successfully combine family life with personal hobbies and careers. Every year they tried to take a vacation. For Robert and Sabrina, trips to religious places and participation in charity events were important, which further strengthened their connection to their faith and to each other. However, despite all of this, life doesn't always go according to plan. On August 17, 2014, an event occurred that shocked everyone who knew Robert Limon. He was alone in a railroad shop in Tehachapi, California, about 135 kilometers from home, when he was suddenly the victim of an attack. The killer attacked him at a moment when Robert was unprotected and his life was ruthlessly taken. It was a fateful day that forever changed not only the lives of his family, but the entire community in which they lived. Around 9:00 a.m., when most people were just starting their workday, law enforcement received a call of a possible robbery at a BNSF warehouse located in Tehachapi, California. A company employee reported that a man was found with gunshot wounds inside the railroad shop. The signal was relayed to the nearest police station, and several patrols soon arrived on the scene. When the police reached the scene, they immediately noticed that the situation was not typical of a robbery. There was utter chaos in the warehouse room. Robert Limon was lying on the floor, and the blood marks stood out vividly against the dirty concrete. He was dressed in his work uniform, as one would expect of an employee of the local railroad company. Outwardly, the situation seemed as if the man had been at the center of something more violent than the usual criminal incident. Robert's body was in a rather gruesome condition. He had been shot twice. The first shot had gone through the stomach, but the second was fatal. A bullet fired from a large caliber weapon had penetrated his head, causing instant death. It is quite possible that Robert didn't even have time to realize what had happened. He was away from his home, on the grounds of an industrial facility where he was presumably supposed to feel safe. At first, law enforcement thought it was a robbery gone wrong. This was because the warehouse itself was located in an industrial area where other businesses operated, and the facility itself was filled with various appliances and parts. The fear of possible criminals wanting to seize a large sum of money or other valuables justified this hypothesis. However, when examining the scene and analyzing what was around, doubts arose. No valuables or documents were found. There were no obvious signs of a struggle at the scene, nor were there any signs that the killer was looking for money or valuables. All of this once again confirmed that this was something more than just a random crime. On further inspection of the area, police found several rounds of ammunition, which could also indicate a crime with a prearranged weapon. The condition of the room where the murder occurred also played an important role in understanding the events. The warehouse was semi-empty, with nothing visible that could have been used for defense or concealment. The location was most likely a random choice by the perpetrator rather than a pre-selected target. After a closer inspection of the area, CCTV cameras were found installed around the perimeter of the industrial park where the warehouse was located. Police immediately decided that this could be a crucial clue to solving the crime. They requested access to the footage in order to study the footage, to draw conclusions about the possible movements of the person who was near the murder scene. CCTV cameras could allow them to establish who was in the area at the time of the crime. In the meantime, the investigation continued to develop, and soon the police decided to notify Robert Limon's family of the tragic news. At first, it was hard to believe what had happened. Sabrina Limon, Robert's wife, was shocked by the news. She, like everyone who knew her and Robert, could not imagine that something like this could have happened to them. Their family was an example of a perfect life. 2 children, stable jobs, a friendly atmosphere. Everyone who knew them said they were a wonderful couple, and their family was cared for by the entire community. Sabrina, when she heard this terrible news, was instantly speechless. At the time of the notification of her husband's death, she was at home doing household chores. Her shock was evident, and her reaction was genuine. She couldn't believe this had happened to Robert, and her eyes clearly read not only confusion, but also anger that someone had taken her husband's life. She immediately began to support the children, trying to explain to them what had happened, although she herself was clearly at a loss as to how to live her life. When news of Robert Limon's murder spread, neighbors and friends were shocked. No one could believe that anyone could wish such a kind and decent man dead. Robert was known among his loved ones as a man with an open and kind heart, always ready to help. He and Sabrina seemed like the perfect couple. Their relationship was an example to many. Everyone who knew them spoke of a strong family supporting each other. Those close to them claimed that they always looked happy and harmonious, that their marriage was filled with love and mutual understanding. Many emphasized that Robert was a good husband and father, and his relations with his children and others were always warm and caring. But despite the outward idyll, no one knew what was going on in their private life behind closed doors, and what could be hiding behind this flawless picture. Robert's family couldn't understand who could have caused him such pain. Lots of people expressed condolences and offered their support. When police began investigating Robert Limon's murder, several key points immediately caught their attention. One of the first steps investigators took was to obtain video footage from surveillance cameras installed in the industrial complex around the railroad depot in Tehachapi where the crime occurred. Those cameras could have captured the moment of the crime, and they did. The footage showed a suspicious motorcyclist who appeared near the depot on the day of the murder. The police noticed this footage because the motorcycle in the industrial area was prominent and could probably belong to the killer. However, at the time, the police could not definitively say that this was the crime, as the only data they had was an image of a motorcyclist moving in the area of the warehouse complex. Still, the footage was an important first step that gave police a direction for further searches. Investigators began gathering information, which was unusual for an investigation of this kind. They decided to focus not only on the physical evidence, but also on the more personal side of Robert and Sabrina Limon's lives. After investigating the family circumstances, the police soon discovered that Sabrina Limon was having an affair with 24-year-old Jonathan Hearn, a local firefighter known for his religiosity and good reputation in the community. This relationship was at first glance completely unnoticed, as the couple behaved quite normally in public places, and no one would have thought that there was something more lurking behind the closed doors of their lives. However, as soon as the police learned of the affair between Sabrina and Jonathan, they began to investigate his phone records. Once in the possession of the investigation, these records yielded shocking data. Thousands of messages and calls were found in their phones, confirming their close relationship. This fact was important enough to alert investigators to the personal connections between the suspects and bring new details to the investigation. The seemingly obvious connection between Sabrina and Jonathan opened new possibilities for understanding the motive of the murder, but at the same time left questions requiring additional evidence. Nevertheless, one aspect of Jonathan's behavior became even more suspicious. Despite the huge number of calls and messages in the previous days, his phone had not been used on the day of Robert Limon's murder. This fact was quite strange and contrary to the normal practices of people involved in such a complex relationship. It didn't give investigators enough grounds for charges, but it became a red flag that further brought Jonathan into the limelight. Following this, the police decided to take a risky step and start tapping the phones of both suspects, Sabrina and Jonathan. This was done despite the lack of direct evidence pointing to their direct involvement in the murder. The police hoped that the conversations between the two could provide additional clues to the events of the day, and if they were indeed involved in the crime, it could be revealed through their conversations. At first, the tapped phone conversations didn't contain overtly criminal statements, but some details were unusual. During one conversation, Sabrina told Jonathan that the detective wanted to talk to her about her husband's murder, to which Jonathan responded in a strange and pithy way, "God, please, help us to be wise. Help Sabrina to say the right words. Please comfort her. Please give her clarity of thought." This was quite unusual, especially considering that they were essentially just discussing their reactions to the investigation without expressing any obvious signs of guilt or fear. However, their words, which addressed religious themes and included prayers, struck investigators as odd, especially in light of the fact that Robert Limon's murder had not been solved, and the conversation itself remained essentially unclear. Police continued to examine the phone data and discovered more conversations in which Jonathan and Sabrina discussed their next steps. These conversations did not provide direct evidence of guilt, but the couple's behavior seemed odd and somewhat unnatural for people in such a stressful situation. They were clearly trying to keep their cool, but their strange conversations and constant references to religious topics seemed to the investigators to be an attempt to hide the real state of affairs. It was this excessive calmness and strange confidence in their words that began to alarm them. Thus, although suspicions began to develop, neither Sabrina nor Jonathan could yet be charged with certainty. All the clues that led investigators to them only pointed to possible involvement, but did not provide a definitive answer. They became the prime suspects, but it was important to keep working on gathering facts and evidence to eliminate all doubts. At that point, the investigators were cautious in their conclusions, realizing that it was premature to accuse people based on circumstantial evidence alone. They had a few key factors in their hands, but that evidence still didn't give a complete picture. All of this confirmed that the job was in its early stages, and more steps were needed to establish exactly who was behind Robert Limon's murder. When the police began investigating the murder of Robert Limon, the main task became finding concrete evidence that could link the killer to the crime. One of the first steps was to examine surveillance footage from cameras located in an industrial area near the railroad warehouse where the murder took place. The cameras captured a suspicious motorcyclist who appeared at the scene on the day of the murder. The motorcycle, as well as the man's actions, raised considerable questions for investigators, as his behavior in an area with limited access and few people was atypical. Investigators carefully analyzed the footage and determined that the motorcycle seen in the video was quite rare and unusual. Although the mere fact that the motorcyclist appeared was not enough in itself to warrant a direct accusation, it became an important landmark for further searches. Police began a check, discovering that a motorcycle similar to the one in the recording belonged to Jonathan Hearn, a 24-year-old firefighter from Tehachapi. Realizing that this motorcycle could be a key element in the investigation, investigators requested a search warrant for Jonathan Hearn's home. A search of his home and work was conducted, marking a major turning point in the case. The search was meticulously planned and involved multiple police units to ensure security and rapid evidence collection. Several items were found in Jonathan's home and workplace that could directly link him to the murder of Robert Limon. One of the most significant finds were the large caliber firearms that were recovered from Jonathan's home. Among them were several guns matching the caliber of the weapon used in Robert's murder. Through questioning and further analysis of these weapons, investigators concluded that they may have been pre-arranged for the crime. This discovery was important evidence that Jonathan may not have just happened to be at the crime scene, but was connected to the murder on a deeper level. In addition, investigators found documents at Jonathan's workplace that also confirmed his relationship with Sabrina. This evidence not only pointed to his connection to the woman suspected of organizing the murder, but also suggested that he may have been her accomplice. This was an important point for the police, as the relationship between Jonathan and Sabrina now looked much more suspicious. Once the police had confirmation that the motorcycle did indeed belong to Jonathan, and that he had access to weapons as well as a connection to a woman whose relationship with Robert Limon seemed increasingly strained, the investigation began to focus on him as the prime suspect. At that point, police had enough evidence to link Jonathan to the murder. On November 18, 2014, several months after Robert's murder, both Jonathan Hearn and Sabrina Limon were arrested. Both were detained on suspicion of involvement in Robert's murder. However, at the time, insufficient evidence against Sabrina led to the charges against her being dropped. The police could not confirm her involvement in the crime, despite the existence of evidence to prove her involvement with Jonathan. However, despite the dropping of charges, the investigation continued, and investigators kept trying to find additional evidence. Meanwhile, the relationship between Sabrina and Jonathan continued to grow, but it also became even more strained. At this time, Jonathan began to experience internal conflict, realizing that the consequences of their actions could lead to the destruction of their lives. Moreover, he was pressured by the information that the investigation was bringing them closer every day to uncovering the whole truth. All of this led to Jonathan Hearn making a surprise confession in January 2017, a couple days before his court hearing. On January 6, 2017, Jonathan turned his back on Sabrina and made the decision to tell the whole truth. He agreed to make a confession that was a turning point in the investigation. In his statement, he revealed that Sabrina was the one who wanted Robert killed. According to Jonathan, she could not divorce Robert because divorce would have ruined her social standing. This statement shook up the whole case, as it not only confirmed her involvement, but also revealed her motive. Sabrina, according to Jonathan's version, could not allow her marriage to Robert to dissolve because it would jeopardize her reputation in the community, where she was praised as an example of a perfect wife and mother. After the arrest of Jonathan Hearn, who testified, police and prosecutors came to the clear conclusion that he was involved in Robert Limon's murder. His confession was the deciding factor, and he was soon formally arrested. Jonathan explained that the murder was organized at the request of Sabrina, who could not afford a divorce because it would destroy her social status. His testimony and the evidence collected finally convinced the investigation that Sabrina was the one who initiated the crime. It took several years after Jonathan's arrest before Sabrina Limon was apprehended. Although there was not initially enough evidence to arrest her, Jonathan's confession, as well as other evidence related to her involvement in the murder, left no doubt about her guilt. Thus, by the time she was apprehended, the investigation was already fully convinced of her role in the crime. The trial against Jonathan Hearn began in January 2017, several years after his arrest. His confession to the murder of Robert Limon played a key role in the unfolding of the trial, but the process was not straightforward. Prosecutors and defense attorneys fought an uphill battle trying to determine Jonathan's degree of guilt and his involvement in the crime. In his confession, Jonathan stated that he committed the murder under pressure from Sabrina Limon, who could not allow her husband to divorce her because it would destroy her social status in their community. He claimed she convinced him to help her get rid of Robert. During the trial, the prosecution adduced evidence relating to Jonathan's personal effects, including weapons found in his home and his presence at the scene of the crime as recorded by CCTV cameras. It was significant that Jonathan was not only present at the scene of the crime, but was actively involved in its preparation. Under the pressure of evidence and testimony, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, agreeing to a plea deal with prosecutors in exchange for his cooperation and assistance in convicting Sabrina Limon. Throughout his trial, Jonathan appeared remorseful. His attorneys tried to soften his sentence, claiming that he was merely a pawn in the hands of Sabrina, who manipulated him to her advantage. Given that Jonathan agreed to cooperate with law enforcement and provide key testimony against Sabrina, the prosecution offered him a lighter sentence. Sabrina Limon's trial began in early 2018, several years after Jonathan's arrest. She initially denied her involvement in Robert's murder, but the trial, based on Jonathan's testimony as well as the evidence gathered, was a major blow to her defense. Sabrina maintained throughout the trial that she had no part in the murder and that her relationship with Jonathan was purely personal and unrelated to the crime. However, the evidence obtained during the investigation left no doubt about her involvement in the conspiracy. The testimony of Jonathan, who claimed that she was the initiator of the murder, as well as his participation in the preparation of the crime, became the main arguments of the prosecution. The court paid special attention to motive. Sabrina, according to the prosecution, could not accept a divorce from Robert because it would undermine her reputation and social standing. Thus, motive was not only related to personal relationships, but also to social status. The testimony of Jonathan, who described how Sabrina manipulated him, proved to be the deciding factor. Despite this, Sabrina insisted on her innocence and claimed that she did not know Jonathan could go to such extreme measures. Forensic experts also pointed to her calm demeanor after the murder, which according to the prosecution was further evidence of her involvement in the crime. However, Sabrina's defense tried to argue that her behavior was simply a manifestation of shock and not evidence of guilt. On January 25, 2017, a court in Tehachapi found Jonathan Hearn guilty of committing the murder of Robert Limon. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, with mitigating circumstances for pleading guilty and cooperating with law enforcement. The court considered mitigating factors such as his confession and assistance in the conviction of Sabrina Limon. On February 6, 2017, the court sentenced Jonathan Hearn to 25 years and 4 months in prison, including time spent in custody. On January 10, 2018, the court in Tehachapi found Sabrina Limon guilty of murdering her husband Robert Limon based on evidence gathered during the investigation as well as the testimony of Jonathan Hearn. The court found that her motive was to maintain her social status and avoid divorce. Despite her denials and defenses based on the lack of direct evidence of her involvement, the court found her to be a responsible organizer of the crime. On February 15, 2018, Sabrina Limon was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of life. The court rejected her appeal in 2022, and her sentence stood. Frank Spencer was born on September 3, 1965 in Pennsylvania. From childhood, he grew up surrounded by hard-working people, which shaped his character. Calm, reliable, with a love of physical labor. After school, he became a builder and gradually built a successful career specializing in building renovation. His work brought not only a steady income, but also satisfaction, as he saw the results of his labor. Frank was a man who appreciated the simple pleasures of life. Walks in nature, vacationing with his family, and socializing with friends. But his personal life remained in the background for a long time. Everything changed when he met Maria in the early 2000s. Maria was a bright, energetic woman capable of charming anyone. She attracted Frank with her confidence and vitality. Their relationship developed quickly, and they were soon married. In the early years of marriage, the couple's life seemed happy. They bought a house in a quiet neighborhood, furnished it together, and rejoiced in the appearance of children. Frank fully devoted himself to providing for the family, working almost without weekends. Maria at this time was engaged in the house and children, creating coziness. Their friends and neighbors considered them a model family. However, over time, the initial cracks in the relationship began to become more noticeable. Maria displayed a temper and a tendency to be controlling. She was jealous of Frank, checking his cell phone and demanding more attention. Financial issues also caused conflicts. Maria loved luxury and often spent more than their means allowed, which irritated Frank, who was a practical man. Gradually, disputes began to grow into real scandals. Maria threatened Frank more and more often, especially when she didn't get what she wanted. She began to refer to her father, Rocco Franklin, as a man who could solve problems. Rocco had a reputation for having a dark past, and these threats caused Frank serious misgivings. By the mid-2000s, their relationship had finally soured. Frank increasingly thought about divorce, but realized that this would lead to even more conflict. In addition, he wanted to maintain stability for his children. Nevertheless, by the end of 2011, he decided to take this step. The divorce became a real war. Maria demanded a significant part of the property and continued to threaten him, stating that he would regret it. The divorce was finalized in mid-2012, but the tension did not disappear. Maria continued to interfere in Frank's life, threatening him directly and through mutual acquaintances. She claimed that her father, Rocco, would deal with him if he did not fulfill her conditions. These threats became a source of constant fear for Frank. Amid these challenges, Frank tried to keep the house warm for his children. In 2011, he decided to get a dog to please them and provide some distraction from the stressful environment. He chose a Weimaraner, which the kids named Matley. The dog quickly became part of the family, and Frank found comfort in him during the most difficult moments. He often told his friends that Matley was the best anti-stressor in his life. However, even this could not rid him of the feeling of impending threat. The divorce only increased Mary's aggression, and her threats became more and more frightening. Frank began to seriously discuss with his friends the possibility of installing surveillance cameras around his home to protect himself and the children. On Tuesday, July 3, 2012, the summer sun was rising over the small town where Frank Spencer lived. Frank's house, located on a quiet street, looked unaccustomedly quiet. There was no traffic, no noise of a working television, no dog noises that usually accompanied the morning hours. To the neighbors, this was the first red flag. By lunchtime, Frank's concerned friends and family began calling each other. The man, known for his punctuality and habit of always being on call, did not answer the phone. His closest friends couldn't remember him ever just turning his phone off. Deciding that the situation was urgent, they contacted the police. When officers arrived at Frank Spencer's home, the place didn't look suspicious. The windows and doors were intact, and the gate was ajar, as if Frank had just returned and had not had time to close it behind him. However, as they approached the porch, the officers noticed something strange. The front door was open, but there was no movement inside. The police officers, following protocol, slowly entered the house. The first thing that struck them was the ominous silence. The house was in disarray, though not so significant as to suggest a burglary at first glance. It looked more like the signs of a struggle. There was a faint odor of blood in the air, and that sign made the officers immediately aware that the situation was serious. When they reached the kitchen, they stopped. A man's body lay on the floor. Frank Spencer had been found dead, with gunshot wounds to the chest area. His body was in a position that indicated that he had either attempted to flee or had been taken by surprise. An examination of the crime scene began immediately. The police recorded that the door had not been forced, which meant that Frank had most likely let whoever came in on his own. That could mean he knew the killer, or at least didn't consider him a threat. In addition to the body, the kitchen was a mess. Overturned chairs, a broken cup, and a crack in one of the cabinets. All of these things indicated that there may have been a struggle before the murder. But what caught the most attention was the rubber cleaning glove lying on the floor. It looked out of place, as if it had been accidentally dropped or forgotten. When the forensic team began to analyze the glove, their finding was significant. They found traces of DNA on the inside, which they later identified. However, at the time, this was only a clue that had yet to be connected to the rest of the facts. One of the key findings was a partial shoe sole imprinted in a pool of blood next to Frank's body. The footprint was not clear enough for instant identification, but experts were able to determine its size and model of shoe. It turned out to be a popular brand of sneakers that was sold in local stores. While it did not directly answer the question of the killer's identity, the print could be useful for further investigation. When officers arrived at Frank Spencer's home, the place didn't look suspicious. The windows and doors were intact, and the gate was ajar, as if Frank had just returned and had not had time to close it behind him. However, as they approached the porch, the officers noticed something strange. The front door was open, but there was no movement inside. The police officers, following protocol, slowly entered the house. The first thing that struck them was the ominous silence. The house was in disarray, though not so significant as to suggest a burglary at first glance. It looked more like the signs of a struggle. There was a faint odor of blood in the air, and that sign made the officers immediately aware that the situation was serious. When they reached the kitchen, they stopped. A man's body lay on the floor. Frank Spencer had been found dead, with gunshot wounds to the chest area. His body was in a position that indicated that he had either attempted to flee or had been taken by surprise. An examination of the crime scene began immediately. The police recorded that the door had not been forced, which meant that Frank had most likely let whoever came in on his own. That could mean he knew the killer, or at least didn't consider him a threat. In addition to the body, the kitchen was a mess. Overturned chairs, a broken cup, and a crack in one of the cabinets. All of these things indicated that there may have been a struggle before the murder. But what caught the most attention was the rubber cleaning glove lying on the floor. It looked out of place, as if it had been accidentally dropped or forgotten. When the forensic team began to analyze the glove, their finding was significant. They found traces of DNA on the inside, which they later identified. However, at the time, this was only a clue that had yet to be connected to the rest of the facts. One of the key findings was a partial shoe sole imprinted in a pool of blood next to Frank's body. The footprint was not clear enough for instant identification, but experts were able to determine its size and model of shoe. It turned out to be a popular brand of sneakers that was sold in local stores. While it did not directly answer the question of the killer's identity, the print could be useful for further investigation. The cleaning glove found at the crime scene immediately came under scrutiny. When forensics revealed that a DNA profile matching that of Maria Spencer, Frank's ex-wife, was found inside, it raised serious suspicions among investigators. Maria and Frank had only recently finalized a long and painful divorce that was accompanied by mutual grievances. According to Frank's friends, Maria repeatedly threatened him, and their conflict reached such a sharp point that Frank even talked about the possibility of a physical threat from her entourage. However, the glove alone did not prove Maria's direct involvement. It could have been there by accident or left there by third parties who wanted to frame her. Nevertheless, it was an important signal for the investigation to pay attention to her alibi and possible motives. The shoe print found near Frank's body also proved to be an important clue. Forensic experts determined that the footprint belonged to a popular brand of athletic shoes, but the interesting thing was different. The size of the shoes matched the size worn by Maria's father, Rocco Franklin. Rocco was rumored to have ties to the underworld. His name was often mentioned in the context of Maria and Frank's history, with Frank himself repeatedly telling friends that he feared her father's interference in their disagreement. However, investigators have yet to have evidence that Rocco was actually at Frank's house on the day of the murder. Nevertheless, this evidence led the police to request Rocco's whereabouts on the day of the crime and see if he could have been involved. When Frank's truck was found in Sunbury, it seemed like a coincidence. However, the location where it was found was suspicious. It was only 5 miles from Maria's home, which increased the likelihood of her involvement. Forensics found no fingerprints or DNA when they examined the truck, but the very fact that it had been left so close to her home seemed odd. It may have been done on purpose to confuse the investigation, but it could also have been a coincidence. At this stage, police decided to request CCTV footage from the area where the truck was found to see who brought it there. The most unusual detail was the appearance of Matley 40 miles from Frank's home on the Peter Allen House estate. At first it looked like an accident, but later it became apparent that the dog had somehow escaped from the criminal's car. The question was how Matley ended up so far away from the crime scene. When the police found out that Matley was at the wedding on the day of the murder, they checked surveillance footage around the estate. It turned out that a vehicle similar to Frank's truck had previously been spotted near the location. This heightened suspicions that those who drove the car away may have stopped in the area. Cell phone movement data provided the next important clue. One of the numbers actively used on the day of the murder was recorded near Frank's house on the morning of July 1, and later in the Sunbury area where the truck was found and near the Peter Allen House estate. When police identified the owner of the phone, it turned out that the number was registered to an acquaintance of Maria's. This man had not previously been involved in their family conflicts, but now his presence at key points along the route caught the attention of investigators. At this stage, the investigation began to return increasingly to the figure of Maria Spencer. Although there was no direct evidence of her involvement, many factors pointed to her possible role in the incident. The DNA on the glove, the location of the truck, and her known threats against Frank had investigators focusing on her alibi. Maria claimed she was at home on the day of the murder, but her words were not yet backed up by other evidence. Police requested phone records and began interviewing people who may have seen her on the day of the crime. In parallel, the police turned their attention to Rocco Franklin, Maria's father. His reputation as a man capable of solving conflicts with radical methods did not leave the investigators no peace. Rocco's movements on the day of the murder showed that his phone was also recorded in the area of the Peter Allen House estate, which coincided with the route of the truck and the location of Matley's appearance. Rocco, however, categorically denied involvement. He claimed he was at home all day, but his phone records said otherwise. Investigators began checking to see who might have been with him at the time and looking for witnesses who could confirm or deny what he said. In this way, the evidence gathered began to point to possible suspects, but the police had yet to draw any definitive conclusions. They had yet to connect the disparate facts and prove who exactly was involved in Frank Spencer's murder. The investigators began to act quickly, focusing on two main figures: Maria Spencer, the murdered man's ex-wife, and her father, Rocco Franklin. After gathering evidence and analyzing data, they concluded that without direct questioning of these two men, it was impossible to get a clear picture. With each new piece of evidence, the pressure on them increased. The decision was made to call the main suspects in for questioning. During the interrogation phase, Maria, whose demeanor had previously shown absolute confidence in her own correctness, began to show signs of fatigue. Her calmness gave way to irritation, and the pauses between answers became longer and longer. The investigators, methodically leading her to the key points, emphasized the evidence they had found. When she was shown a photograph of a rubber glove found at the crime scene, her expression changed. It was the first obvious reaction to the evidence presented. There was tension in her voice as she tried to explain that the glove could have been left in the house from the time she lived there. However, the investigators knew this was impossible. The house had been thoroughly cleaned, and Frank had replaced all the household utensils. Gradually, Maria recognized that her presence near Frank's house on the day of the murder could not have been a coincidence. She said that she had indeed been in the neighborhood on the day of the murder, but denied that she had entered the house. According to her, she only wanted to see what Frank was doing, perhaps to talk to him. She claimed she had no intention of hurting him, but her excuses looked increasingly unconvincing. When the investigators mentioned the truck found near her house, Maria began to lose control of the situation. She claimed to know nothing about the truck, but her nervousness was becoming evident. The mention of Matley's dog, which had somehow ended up 40 miles from the victim's home, caused her obvious anxiety. She avoided direct answers, instead lapsing into general phrases that were irrelevant. Her partial confession concerned only the fact of her presence near the house on the day of the murder. She denied her involvement in the crime, but her words and demeanor betrayed her confusion and obvious attempts to hide something important. Rocco Franklin, on the other hand, showed equanimity from the beginning. He came to the interrogation confident in his ability to withstand any pressure. His answers were confident and his manner mocking. However, as the investigators began to outline the evidence they had gathered, his tone began to change. The mention of cell phone data that recorded his movements forced him to change his tactics. He admitted that he had been near Frank's house on the day of the murder, but tried to explain it away as a coincidence. Rocco claimed that he accompanied Maria to make sure she didn't make a mess. According to him, he did not enter the house and did not know what his daughter was planning. However, evidence of a shoe print found near the body weakened his position. Investigators pointed out that the size and model of the sneakers matched the one he was wearing. In response, Rocco tried to justify himself by claiming that it was a popular model and such sneakers could have been worn by many people. However, his arguments sounded less and less convincing. When investigators moved on to the issue of Matley's dog, Rocco was clearly confused. He was told that the dog had been found near his home, a coincidence too obvious to be coincidental. He tried to claim that he knew nothing about it, but his voice became less confident and his answers became clipped. Rocco partially admitted that he had accompanied Maria on the day of the murder, but continued to insist that he had not entered the house. His words contradicted earlier evidence, raising suspicions of his involvement in the crime. Maria and Rocco's partial confessions allowed investigators to identify contradictions in their versions. Maria claimed that Rocco insisted on accompanying her and acted at his own discretion. Rocco, on the other hand, tried to portray himself as an outside observer who was only trying to prevent a possible conflict. These discrepancies reinforced suspicions that both were trying to shift blame onto each other. Through interrogations, investigators obtained confirmation of their presence at the crime scene, although neither suspect admitted direct guilt. Their partial confessions and conflicting statements became the basis for further action. After the interrogations, investigators had a fairly clear picture. Despite Maria and Rocco's denials, the evidence pointed to their possible involvement. It was decided to charge them and take them into custody. Maria was arrested first. When she was informed of the court's decision, her reaction was violent. She screamed that it was a mistake, that the police were persecuting her without reason. Her voice grew louder and louder until she was led out of the station in handcuffs. Her lawyer tried to intervene, but the evidence gathered against her was too strong to ignore. Rocco met the arrest quite differently. He continued to hold his line to the end, remained unfazed, and even threw a couple of derisive comments at the police. As he was being taken away, he said, "You'll be sorry. I'm not going to let this go." Both suspects ended up behind bars. Maria was charged with organizing the murder and Rocco with carrying it out. Police continued to gather more evidence to make sure their case was strong enough for trial. Meanwhile, residents of the town discussed the arrests, trying to understand how it was that a family conflict had led to such tragic consequences. The Frank Spencer murder trial began a few months after the arrests of Maria Spencer and Rocco Franklin. The trial became one of the most anticipated in the county, garnering both local and national press attention. The standoff between the prosecution and defense promised to be intense, as the evidence presented by the investigation was pivotal to the outcome of the case. The prosecutor began the case by describing all the evidence gathered. He detailed for the jury the rubber glove found at the crime scene with Maria Spencer's DNA on it, a shoe print that matched the size and model Rocco was wearing, and cell phone data that recorded their movements on the day of the murder. The prosecutor emphasized the motives: Maria's long and acrimonious divorce from Frank, her threats against her ex-husband, and Rocco's possible desire to protect his granddaughter by any means necessary. Prosecutors argued that Maria organized the murder and Rocco was the perpetrator. The evidence gathered at the crime scene and outside the crime scene, according to the prosecution, was sufficient to prove their guilt. Maria's defense insisted that her client was not directly involved in the murder. The defense attorney argued that the presence of her DNA on the glove could have been due to the fact that she had lived in the house before, and the glove itself could have gotten there by accident. The defense also tried to discredit witness testimony by saying that the threats Maria allegedly made were exaggerated. Rocco Franklin, through his attorney, denied any involvement in the murder. His defense was based on the fact that he was indeed near Frank's house on the day of the murder, but solely to supervise his daughter's actions. The defense counsel insisted that the coincidence of the shoe print and the phone data could not be direct evidence of his guilt. Key points in the trial were the testimony of witnesses and experts. Frank's friends and co-workers testified that Maria repeatedly threatened her ex-husband, mentioning that her father would deal with him. They also testified about the strained relationship between the former spouses, her temper, and attempts at intimidation. Forensic experts presented evidence related to a rubber glove found at the scene. They confirmed that Maria's DNA was found on the inside of the glove, and also emphasized that the glove could not have been left in the house from the time when Maria lived there. In their opinion, it was brought there shortly before the murder. Cell phone movement data was another important element. The prosecutor proved that Maria and Rocco's devices were recorded in key locations: near Frank's house, in the area where the truck was found, and near Harrisburg, where Matley's dog was found. The prosecution's version of events is as follows. On the morning of July 1, 2012, Maria and Rocco arrived at Frank's house. Maria stayed back so as not to attract attention, and Rocco entered the house under the pretense of talking. A conflict arose between him and Frank that escalated into a physical confrontation. In the course of it, Rocco shot Frank, leaving his shoe marks in the blood. They then left the house, taking Frank's truck and his dog with them. Along the way, they stopped in the Harrisburg area, where the dog got out of the truck and ran to the nearest place that caught his attention, the Peter Allen House estate, where a wedding was being held. The truck was later left in Sunbury to confuse the investigation. On June 27, 2013, the court delivered its final verdict in the Frank Spencer murder trial. After weeks of deliberation and 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Maria Spencer guilty of second-degree organized murder. Her father, Rocco Franklin, was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, in announcing the verdict, emphasized that the crime was carefully planned and committed with cold-blooded brutality. Your actions were intended to eliminate a person whom you considered an obstacle in your life. Instead of choosing legal ways to resolve the conflict, you both took the path of violence, violating not only the law but also basic human morality. The court believes that society must be protected from such people, the judge said in his address to the convicts. Maria Spencer was sentenced to life in prison without parole for organizing the crime. Rocco Franklin received the same sentence for carrying it out. Thus, the court found them equally responsible, noting that without each of them, the murder might not have occurred.